I was buttoning my faded denim shirt for Sunday dinner at my daughter's house when my lawyer called with a chilling warning. He commanded me to lock my front door immediately and avoid her estate at all costs. What he exposed about my own flesh and blood changed my life entirely. My name is Derek. I am 69 years old and a retired commercial builder who spent 4 decades turning bare dirt into concrete empires. Today, I am going to tell you how the family I sacrificed everything for tried to lock me away in a mental ward. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your quiet strength. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across my bedroom floor as I fastened the brass buttons of my work shirt. I was preparing for the mandatory Sunday dinner at the upscale suburban estate belonging to Naomi and Colin. These dinners were always strained affairs filled with subtle insults and condescending remarks about my simple lifestyle. I endured them out of a quiet obligation to the memory of my late wife Evelyn, who always begged me to keep the family together. I reached for my worn belt when my phone vibrated sharply against the heavy oak dresser. The screen flashed the familiar name Sullivan. He was my wealth management attorney and fiercely loyal friend who handled my financial affairs for over 2 decades. Sullivan never called on a Sunday unless a financial catastrophe was unfolding. I answered the phone expecting news about a market fluctuation or a tax discrepancy. Sullivan bypassed all customary greetings. His voice carried an absolute chilling urgency that froze the blood in my veins. He ordered me to lock the deadbolt and close every blind in the house. He explicitly commanded me not to drive to Naomi's house under any circumstances. I stood perfectly still, processing the sheer panic in the voice of a man who made a living out of remaining completely unbothered by high-stakes litigation. Sullivan took a sharp breath and told me that my life as a free man was in immediate jeopardy. The dinner invitation was a carefully orchestrated illusion designed to strip me of my fundamental rights. I asked him to explain exactly what was happening. Sullivan spoke with the rapid precision of a man holding a ticking bomb. He revealed that a private, unmarked medical transport van was currently idling in the back alley behind Naomi's manicured property. He had received a vital tip from a highly placed contact within the municipal health department exactly 10 minutes ago. My son-in-law Colin had bypassed all standard legal channels and bribed a corrupt clinic physician. This compromised doctor had signed a fraudulent emergency psychiatric hold. The medical document falsely and aggressively diagnosed me with late-stage severe dementia, prone to violent outbursts. Sullivan explained that the paperwork gave the transport team total legal authority to use physical restraints if I resisted. The mandatory Sunday dinner was nothing more than a vicious trap designed to ambush me the moment I stepped through their grand double doors. Naomi and Colin planned to force me into that waiting van and lock me inside a heavily guarded mental ward before Monday morning. Once I was admitted under that specific legal hold, they would have unquestioned authority to strip me of my financial autonomy. I stared at the peeling wallpaper of my modest home while the sheer magnitude of their betrayal settled heavily on my shoulders. Colin was a venture capitalist whose tech firm projected an image of massive wealth, but Sullivan had warned me months ago that the boy was secretly drowning in corporate debt. Naomi was entirely consumed by social status and the desperate need to maintain her luxurious facade among her wealthy peers. They viewed me not as a father, but as an inconvenient obstacle standing between them and the quiet wealth I had built over 40 years of backbreaking commercial labor. If I walked into that dining room, I would inevitably walk out strapped tightly inside a medical straitjacket. Sullivan warned me that once the doors of that psychiatric facility locked behind me, proving my sanity would become a monumental legal battle that could take months or years. During that time, Naomi and Colin would systematically drain every account and liquidate every property I owned. The realization that my own flesh and blood had orchestrated my permanent confinement hit me with the force of a physical blow. Sullivan told me he was filing an emergency injunction, but I needed to stay completely out of sight until the federal courts opened their heavy doors for business the very next morning. Before Sullivan could finish detailing his legal strategy, heavy footsteps pounded aggressively against my front porch. The wooden planks groaned under the weight of someone approaching with sudden, purposeful speed. I held my breath and gripped the edge of the dresser. A sharp, brisk knock echoed through the quiet house, followed immediately by the rattle of the doorknob. Naomi's sweet, artificially cheerful voice rang out through the solid oak door. She called out my name with a melodic pitch that she only used when she was trying to manipulate a situation in her favor. She announced that she had decided to drive over early to personally escort me to their estate for dinner. She claimed she wanted to spend some quality time together before Colin finished preparing the meal. The sheer deception in her cheerful tone made my stomach churn. She was not there to share quality time. She was the advance guard sent to ensure the target arrived exactly on schedule for the medical transport team. I realized instantly that I could not simply hide in the dark and pretend I was not home. My old work truck was parked directly in the driveway and the living room lights were blazing. If I refused to answer the door, she would use her emergency key or claim I was having a medical crisis to justify calling the authorities and forcing entry. That would play perfectly into their fabricated narrative of my mental decline. I had to face my daughter and navigate this immediate threat without showing a single ounce of fear or suspicion. If I alerted her to my newfound knowledge of her betrayal, Colin would instantly accelerate his plans and execute the psychiatric hold right here in my own living room. I needed to execute a tactical retreat from my own property while making her believe I was still entirely under her control. I lowered my voice to a bare whisper and instructed Sullivan to ready his legal team for a massive offensive. I hung up the phone and slipped it into the front pocket of my denim shirt. I took a deep, steadying breath and smoothed my collar. I walked toward the front door, preparing to look into the eyes of the woman I raised and act as if she were not actively plotting my total destruction. The battle for my freedom and my legacy had officially begun. I twisted the brass deadbolt and pulled the heavy oak door inward, letting the cool autumn evening breeze sweep into the foyer. Naomi stood on my welcome mat wearing a designer trench coat and a perfectly practiced, utterly hollow smile. Behind her, parked discreetly near the edge of my driveway, I spotted the unmarked white transport van Sullivan had warned me about. Two men in dark scrubs sat in the front seats, their faces obscured by the shadows, waiting for my daughter to deliver her target. I looked into Naomi's eyes and saw the cold, calculated intent hiding just beneath her cheerful greeting. She reached out to take my arm, ready to guide me straight into their snare. I did not give her the satisfaction. Instead, I drove my knuckles into the center of my chest, exactly over my sternum, and let out a sharp, ragged gasp. I forced my knees to buckle, allowing my entire body weight to crash heavily onto the polished hardwood floor. The impact sent a painful jolt up my spine, but I maintained the performance, squeezing my eyes shut and taking shallow, desperate breaths. I clawed at my faded denim shirt, twisting the fabric in my fists as if fighting for air. Naomi froze. Her perfectly manicured facade shattered in an instant. She looked past my writhing body toward the idling white van, then down at me, paralyzingly aware of the sudden legal peril she faced. If an elderly man died of a massive heart attack on his own threshold while a private uncalled medical transport vehicle waited mysteriously in the driveway, the police would undoubtedly launch an immediate homicide investigation. Her pristine social standing and Colin's fragile corporate image could never survive that level of catastrophic public scrutiny. I let out another guttural groan, ensuring my distress sounded entirely authentic and life-threatening. Panic finally overrode her malicious blueprint. She frantically waved the unmarked van away, silently commanding them to retreat before anyone noticed their presence. With trembling fingers, she pulled her smartphone from her designer purse and dialed the emergency services dispatch. I kept my face pressed against the cool wood of the floor, controlling my breathing to match the rhythm of a failing heart. The private trap had been successfully broken, but the journey into the public light was just beginning. The harsh, rhythmic wail of the city ambulance siren provided a chaotic soundtrack to my calculated deception. I lay strapped securely to the narrow transport stretcher, a thick oxygen mask strapped over my face, keeping my eyes reduced to tiny, unnoticeable slits. The paramedics worked efficiently around me, calling out fake vital signs that I managed to manipulate through sheer physical willpower and focused breathing. Naomi sat in the cramped corner of the speeding vehicle, her body tense and rigid. She was not holding my hand or watching my monitor with the anxious devotion of a loving daughter. Instead, she had her face turned toward the rear window, her hand cupping her mouth as she hissed frantically into her cell phone. I strained to listen over the rumble of the engine. She was speaking to Colin, her voice dripping with venomous frustration rather than grief. I heard her curse the sudden public nature of my collapse. A standard hospital admission meant digital records, mandatory evaluations by objective state physicians, and a rigid bureaucratic paper trail that completely dismantled their streamlined private institutionalization scheme. They needed me to vanish quietly into a specialized facility they had already bought and paid for. Now I was a highly visible patient in the municipal healthcare system. As I listened to her complain about the inconvenience of my supposed cardiac arrest, a deep, familiar ache settled in my chest, completely unrelated to any physical illness. I remembered the sterile hospital room 5 years ago where my wife Evelyn spent her final hours. Evelyn had gripped my calloused hand, her breathing shallow, and warned me about the very woman sitting mere feet away from me now. Evelyn had seen the terrifying ambition taking root in Naomi, the way our daughter had begun to measure human value strictly by zip codes, investment portfolios, and corporate titles. Evelyn begged me to guard my heart, warning me that Naomi's loyalty to the family would always run a distant second to her desperate obsession with high society. I had refused to believe those dying words, blinded by a stubborn, foolish, fatherly devotion. Now the bitter truth of Evelyn's warning resonated through every venomous whisper Naomi directed into her phone. I kept my breathing shallow, masking the intense clarity currently sharpening my mind. The ambulance swerved sharply, pulling into the bright, chaotic emergency bay of the downtown hospital. The paramedics wheeled me rapidly through the sliding glass doors of the trauma center, shouting medical codes that triggered a flurry of synchronized activity. Bright fluorescent lights glared against my eyelids as they transferred me from the transport stretcher onto a sterile hospital bed. I maintained my performance of a frail, disoriented old man suffering from acute cardiac distress. Naomi followed closely behind, quickly stowing her phone and adopting the manufactured expression of a deeply traumatized daughter. She hovered near the foot of my bed, her eyes darting nervously around the bustling room, clearly calculating how swiftly she could take control of the narrative. An emergency room physician approached my bedside, introducing himself with professional calm while unsealing a sterile plastic package. He pulled out a syringe and a collection of empty glass vials, explaining that a routine blood draw was the absolute mandatory first step to determine the specific cardiac enzymes present in my system. I watched the sharp steel needle catch the harsh overhead light. My pulse quickened, driven by genuine adrenaline rather than illness. This standard medical procedure was the precise window of opportunity I needed to launch my counterstrike. I knew my heart was completely healthy, forged by decades of carrying lumber and pouring concrete. The standard tests would inevitably return entirely normal results, exposing my collapse as a complete fabrication and handing Naomi the perfect justification to demand a psychiatric evaluation. I could not allow the medical staff to focus exclusively on my heart. I needed to pivot the entire diagnostic investigation towards something far more sinister, something that would immediately incriminate the woman standing at the end of my bed. I remembered the large, sweating glass of sweet iced tea Naomi had practically forced me to drink during her unannounced morning visit. I had noticed a strange bitter aftertaste and only managed to consume a small portion before pouring the rest down the kitchen sink. I had instinctively dabbed the spilled remnants with a thick paper napkin which currently rested deep inside the right pocket of my denim jeans. I needed the doctor to extract my blood, but I desperately needed him to analyze it for foreign narcotics before Naomi realized the trap I was setting. I waited for the physician to step closer, preparing to make the most critical, dangerous gamble of my entire life to secure my freedom. The emergency room physician stepped up to the edge of the mattress, snapping a pair of latex gloves over his hands. He held a small, sterilized plastic tray containing several long needles and 3 empty glass vials. Naomi stood rigidly near the heavy wooden door of the trauma room, her arms crossed tightly over her designer trench coat. She watched the doctor with a predator's intensity, waiting for the blood test to yield normal cardiac results so she could immediately pivot the narrative toward my mental instability. She assumed I was a helpless victim trapped in her elaborate web. She completely underestimated the man who had raised her. I watched her turn her head briefly for a fraction of a second to check her buzzing smartphone. I seized that fleeting window of distraction. I reached deep into the front pocket of my faded denim jeans and extracted the crumpled paper napkin. The rough paper was still damp, heavily stained with the bitter, sweet iced tea Naomi had forced upon me hours earlier at my home. As the physician leaned over to apply a rubber tourniquet to my right bicep, I swiftly pressed the damp napkin directly into the palm of his gloved hand. He paused, his brow furrowing in confusion, about to speak out loud. I locked my eyes directly onto his and offered a gaze of absolute, unyielding clarity. I lowered my voice to a sharp, commanding whisper that cut through the loud, ambient noise of the busy emergency ward. I instructed him to run a comprehensive, immediate toxicology screening on my blood and to test the chemical residue soaking the napkin in his hand. I explicitly stated that I suspected foul play involving severe chemical sedatives and that my daughter, standing near the door, was the primary suspect. The physician's eyes widened slightly as the gravity of my lucid request registered in his mind. He was a trained professional accustomed to dealing with domestic disputes and elder abuse. He discreetly slipped the stained napkin into his coat pocket without uttering a single word. He proceeded to draw my blood with practiced efficiency, filling 3 separate vials before turning his back on Naomi. He announced aloud that standard cardiac protocols required a full battery of specialized laboratory tests, ensuring the process would take at least an hour. My heart pounded with the absolute thrill of the imminent silent counterattack. The 60 excruciating minutes that followed felt like an entire lifetime suspended in sterile amber. I kept my eyes completely shut, maintaining the illusion of an unconscious, fragile victim resting on the uncomfortable mattress. The heavy metal doors of the examination room swung open with a sharp mechanical hiss. The physician marched directly toward the foot of my bed, clutching a fresh printed medical chart. He did not address my daughter first. He looked directly down at me and announced that the laboratory results had returned. The blood chemistry panel confirmed my heart was functioning perfectly, bearing 0 signs of any cardiac distress or muscular damage. However, the toxicology screening painted a terrifying, profoundly criminal picture. The doctor stated with clinical precision that my bloodstream was completely saturated with massive, dangerous doses of heavy commercial sedatives. These synthetic chemicals were specifically formulated and strictly prescribed to induce severe confusion, physical lethargy, and dramatic memory loss in elderly patients. The revelation hit the air like a physical shockwave. The physician raised his head and locked his gaze onto Naomi. His eyes were narrowed, completely stripped of any bedside manner, replaced entirely by the hard, unforgiving scrutiny of a man who recognized attempted elder abuse. Naomi stumbled backward, her mouth falling open as her carefully constructed reality disintegrated. She attempted to stammer a desperate defense, falsely claiming I must have accidentally ingested the wrong prescription medication at home. Before the doctor could interrogate her obvious lie, a loud commotion erupted outside the trauma bay. Colin stormed into the hospital room. His designer suit violently wrinkled, his face flushed with unhinged panic. He marched past the nurses, aggressively brandishing a thick wooden clipboard. He completely ignored the doctor's grim diagnostic announcement and demanded my immediate medical transfer to a private psychiatric facility on the edge of the city. He waved a set of forged authorization papers, shouting that my family had already arranged specialized care for my rapidly deteriorating mental condition. He barked orders like a corporate dictator attempting to overwhelm the medical staff with sheer volume and misplaced authority. The physician stood his ground, folding his arms across his white coat, creating a physical barrier between my bed and my frantic daughter's husband. The confrontation had escalated from a quiet deception into a highly volatile public battle for my physical autonomy. The legal foundation of their plot was rapidly crumbling right now. I pushed myself upright against the sterile hospital pillows, allowing the facade of the broken old man to slip away entirely. I looked directly past the stunned physician and locked my steady gaze onto Colin's sweating face. Using a firm, unyielding tone that echoed through the quiet trauma room, I formally invoked my legal rights as a conscious patient. I explicitly refused the medical transfer, citing the undeniable evidence that my heart condition remained completely stable. The law dictated that no individual could force my relocation against my will without a verified court order, and their forged papers held absolutely 0 legal authority inside a public city hospital. Colin stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, completely recognizing the sharp lucidity returning to my voice. The physician firmly ordered my daughter and her frantic husband out of the examination room, citing hospital security protocols regarding aggressive visitors. The heavy metal doors clicked shut, trapping me safely inside my temporary medical sanctuary. I carefully removed the monitoring clips from my fingertips and swung my legs over the edge of the mattress. I crept toward the solid door and pressed my ear against the cold surface. In the sterile corridor outside, Colin was pacing furiously. His heavy leather shoes squeaked frantically against the linoleum tiles. I heard him dialing his mobile phone with aggressive, desperate strikes. He began screaming into the receiver, entirely abandoning any pretense of familial concern. His voice cracked with the sheer terror of a man watching his entire empire burn to ashes. He yelled at an unknown associate that the massive commercial real estate deal absolutely required my certified psychiatric hold before the banks opened on Friday morning. If I remained legally competent to manage my own vast financial portfolio, the fraudulent investment structure would completely collapse, sending him directly into federal custody. He cursed my name, swearing he would find a darker, more forceful method to secure the necessary documentation. I pulled myself away from the door, my mind racing with cold mechanical precision. My sudden survival had triggered a desperate countdown. I possessed only 4 days to dismantle their ruthless conspiracy. I needed to immediately contact Sullivan to uncover the exact geographic coordinates of the commercial property Colin was illegally leveraging. The battle lines were permanently drawn across the sterile hospital floor. The hunter had successfully become the hunted in this dangerous, perilous game of survival. The fluorescent lights of the trauma corridor dimmed as the hospital transitioned into its quiet midnight rotation. I remained completely still against the stiff hospital pillows, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor. The heavy door clicked open with a soft, metallic thud. A tall figure stepped into the shadowy room wearing a crisp white administrator coat over a tailored charcoal suit. He pulled a generic hospital identification badge from his lapel and placed it silently on the rolling tray table. It was Sullivan. My attorney moved with the practiced grace of a man accustomed to navigating hostile corporate boardrooms and secured government facilities. He locked the door behind him and drew the thick privacy blinds tightly shut. Sullivan did not offer a greeting or waste a single breath on pleasantries. He placed a sleek, matte black titanium briefcase flat on my mattress. The case possessed no standard locks or combination dials. Sullivan pressed his thumb against a small illuminated biometric scanner near the handle. The case chirped softly and sprang open, revealing a neatly organized cache of thick legal folders and encrypted digital hard drives. This contained my complete, highly classified financial portfolio. I had entrusted Sullivan with the absolute oversight of my assets precisely because he operated with ruthless efficiency and absolute discretion. He pulled a heavy chair close to my bed and leaned forward, his face illuminated only by the faint glow of the vital sign monitors. He confirmed that my tactical delay had worked perfectly. Colin was currently downstairs threatening the hospital security staff, completely unaware that his target was actively reviewing the very financial documents he sought to control. Sullivan handed me a thick stack of printed financial ledgers bound by a heavy brass clip. He stated that he had initiated a rapid, comprehensive audit of my entire liquid and physical asset portfolio the moment I simulated my cardiac collapse. He had spent the last 6 hours tracing every single corporate maneuver Colin had attempted over the past 18 months. Sullivan pointed a long, steady finger at a specific line item buried deep within the 3rd page of the sprawling asset registry. He instructed me to read the highlighted text very carefully. The document detailed a specific parcel of commercial land I had almost entirely forgotten about, a dormant piece of real estate that held the absolute key to Colin's desperate, violent panic. I stared at the black ink highlighting the dusty municipal parcel number and felt an unexpected wave of profound nostalgia wash over me. Exactly 30 years ago, I had purchased a massive, barren tract of industrial dirt sitting completely forgotten on the decaying eastern outskirts of the city. I was an ambitious younger man back then, pouring concrete during the day and drafting architectural blueprints late into the quiet night. I had desperately intended to construct my own massive commercial warehouse on that desolate soil to launch an independent supply enterprise. I wanted to build an unbreakable generational legacy that would effortlessly provide for my growing family. However, my grand ambitions were abruptly forced to halt when my beautiful wife, Evelyn, received her devastating medical diagnosis. The relentless medical treatments drained our accounts and demanded my constant physical presence at her side. I abandoned the warehouse project entirely, leaving the empty dirt lot to become completely overgrown with wild, heavy brush and rusted wire fences. I had considered the property utterly worthless for over 2 decades, keeping the deed tucked away solely for sentimental reasons. Sullivan interrupted my silent reverie by tapping his gold pen firmly against the laminated ledger. He explained that the city council had completely reshaped the Eastern District over the last 3 years, keeping their aggressive urban renewal plans heavily shielded from public scrutiny. They had recently authorized a massive multi-billion-dollar municipal infrastructure initiative, secretly rezoning my forgotten acres of dirt exclusively for a massive commercial technology hub. Sullivan flipped to a freshly printed municipal appraisal document bearing the official seal of the state banking authority. The raw numbers printed on the thick parchment were absolutely staggering. Due to its strategic central location near the newly proposed federal highway expansion, my overgrown industrial lot was currently valued at a staggering $18 million. The sheer financial magnitude of the sudden revelation temporarily stole the breath from my aching lungs. The useless dirt I had abandoned to sit beside Evelyn during her final agonizing months had miraculously transformed into an unimaginable fortune. I looked up at Sullivan, completely understanding the lethal gravity of the situation. Colin and Naomi had discovered the secret appraisal long before I did. They were not attempting to lock me away out of any misguided sense of medical concern. They were ruthlessly hunting the $18 million resting silently beneath the weeds. Sullivan turned to the final page of the thick financial dossier and slid a horrifying supplementary report directly into my hands. He detailed how Colin had secretly procured an enormously dangerous commercial bridge loan to temporarily artificially prop up his failing software company. The venture capital firm was currently hemorrhaging vast amounts of unrecoverable cash and faced an aggressive federal audit by the end of the fiscal week. To secure the desperate emergency capital, Colin had illegally forged my signature on multiple sweeping legal documents listing the absolute deed to my $18 million industrial lot as the sole financial collateral. The bank had approved the massive funds, completely unaware that the underlying asset did not legally belong to the desperate borrower. The stringent terms of the predatory loan dictated a mandatory final reconciliation by 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon. If Colin could not present the verified liquid assets generated from the immediate sale of my property, the ruthless banking auditors would uncover the vast structural fraud. The discovery of such massive wire fraud and grand larceny would inevitably send my son-in-law directly into federal prison for decades. Naomi would instantly lose her opulent suburban estate, her imported vehicles, and the high society status she valued far above human life. They were entirely backed into a lethal, desperate corner. In order to finalize the rapid sale of the commercial land by the strict Friday deadline, Colin absolutely required a legally binding medical declaration of my complete mental incompetence. With that fraudulent clinical document secured, Naomi could instantly activate her forged power of attorney and liquidate the $18 million asset before the auditors arrived. I stared down at my calloused hands, suddenly realizing the terrifying true depth of the immediate peril I faced. If I continued to aggressively resist the psychiatric hold or attempted to contact the local municipal authorities, my desperate son-in-law would have absolutely nothing left to lose. A man staring down the terrifying barrel of a lengthy federal prison sentence would inevitably choose to completely eliminate the single obstacle standing in his immediate way. They would simply arrange a fatal medical accident, ensuring I never left the hospital alive. My physical survival now depended entirely on flawlessly maintaining the fragile illusion of my fading mental state. I handed the dossier back to Sullivan, completely understanding that my life was now actively and physically in severe mortal danger. The harsh morning sunlight sliced through the sterile hospital blinds, signaling the start of my performance. I allowed my jaw to hang slightly slack and fixed my gaze on a blank patch of the opposite wall. When the attending nurse entered with a plastic tray of breakfast food, I swatted it away with clumsy, uncoordinated movements. I mumbled a series of incoherent phrases about needing to pour the concrete foundation for a building that had been completed 30 years ago. Naomi stood in the doorway, watching my sudden deterioration with a mix of clinical fascination and poorly concealed triumph. The massive dose of sedatives she had administered the previous day had provided the perfect alibi for my sudden cognitive collapse. She immediately summoned the lead physician, loudly lamenting that her father had suffered a catastrophic, irreversible break from reality during the night. The doctor, unaware of the lethal toxicity running through my veins, attributed the sudden confusion to hospital-induced delirium common in elderly patients. He recommended a swift discharge to a familiar home environment, inadvertently handing me the exact escape route I desperately required. Naomi eagerly signed the release forms with sweeping, triumphant strokes of her pen. She believed the chemical cocktail had permanently short-circuited my brain, rendering me completely docile and utterly defenseless. She practically pushed my wheelchair toward the hospital exit, whispering promises of arranging full-time care by the end of the week. I slumped forward in the chair, letting my head loll against my chest, playing the role of a hollowed-out shell of a man. The ride back to my neighborhood was filled with her artificial sympathy and Colin's silent, predatory anticipation from the driver's seat. They dropped me at my front porch with a dismissive wave, promising to check on me later. The moment their sleek, black SUV disappeared around the corner of the suburban street, I stood up completely straight. The fog of confusion instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating rage. I walked into my quiet, empty house and locked the heavy deadbolt. I possessed exactly 3 days before their Friday deadline, and I needed to turn my sanctuary into an inescapable digital snare. I moved through the familiar rooms, perfectly aware that my survival depended on absolute precision. Every single step had to be flawlessly calculated now. Under the thick cover of night, I pulled a heavy black duffel bag from the hidden crawl space beneath my staircase. Sullivan had dispatched a trusted private courier to deliver the advanced surveillance equipment hours earlier. I meticulously unpacked 6 high-definition motion-activated micro-cameras. Decades of working as a master builder had blessed me with an intimate knowledge of structural wiring and architectural blind spots. I systematically moved through my living room, dismantling the plastic casings of the overhead smoke detectors and embedding the tiny lenses deep within the internal circuitry. I carefully hollowed out the thick leather spines of several vintage encyclopedias resting on my oak bookshelves, sliding the recording devices into the dark crevices. These cameras possessed wireless transmitters capable of streaming encrypted crystal-clear footage directly to a secure server controlled by Sullivan. Every angle of my living room and front entryway was now completely covered by an invisible, unblinking digital net. With the surveillance grid fully operational, I needed to provide the precise bait required to force Naomi into an overt criminal act. I walked into my home office and retrieved a stack of outdated financial ledgers and mock investment summaries Sullivan had specifically prepared for this deception. I intentionally scattered the papers across the surface of my mahogany desk, leaving a prominent bright red folder labeled with my primary retirement account information right in the center. I strategically positioned a blank, unsigned authorization form near a cup filled with blue ink pens. Naomi possessed a ravenous, uncontrollable appetite for liquid wealth, and presenting her with an unguarded opportunity to access my immediate cash reserves would be completely irresistible. I retreated to my master bedroom, leaving the door slightly ajar. I lay completely still on my mattress, visualizing the architectural blueprints of the trap I had just constructed. Evelyn had always admired my ability to anticipate structural failures before they occurred, and I was now applying that exact identical discipline to my own flesh and blood. The quiet hum of the refrigerator echoed in the dark house, masking the silent digital recording mechanisms waiting patiently in the shadows. I closed my eyes and allowed my breathing to slow, resting my body for the inevitable confrontation that daylight would bring. I knew the predators would arrive the moment they believed I was unguarded and utterly defenseless. The trap was perfectly set. The following afternoon, the sharp metallic click of a key turning in the front door shattered the silence of my home. Naomi pushed the heavy oak door open without bothering to knock, completely violating the sanctity of my private space. She strutted into the living room, her sharp designer heels clicking aggressively against the floorboards. She was flanked by a nervous, sweating man clutching a battered leather briefcase. I recognized him immediately from Sullivan's extensive intelligence reports. He was a disgraced public notary, a desperate individual notorious in the downtown legal district for validating fraudulent documents for a steep cash price. I remained completely out of sight, watching their movements through the live encrypted video feed streaming directly to the secure tablet hidden beneath my bedsheets. Naomi marched straight toward the mahogany desk, her eyes locking onto the scattered financial documents and the prominent red folder I had deliberately staged. She let out a soft, triumphant laugh, marveling at my supposed cognitive decline for leaving such valuable information entirely unguarded. She instructed the sweating notary to unpack his official seals. The high-definition micro-cameras hidden inside the hollowed-out encyclopedias captured every single microscopic detail in stunning, undeniable clarity. I watched the live feed as Naomi retrieved a sweeping total power of attorney document from her designer handbag. She leaned over my desk, gripped a blue ink pen, and flawlessly replicated my signature at the bottom of the page. The disgraced notary quickly stamped the fraudulent document with his official state seal, legally validating the monumental forgery. Naomi casually remarked to her accomplice that they needed to act quickly to systematically drain my liquid retirement accounts before the final institutionalization scheduled for Friday morning. She openly confessed her intention to leave me entirely penniless, ensuring I would have absolutely no financial resources to combat the psychiatric hold once the doors of the mental ward locked behind me. Her callous, venomous words confirmed the absolute eradication of any lingering paternal affection I held for her. She handed the notary a thick envelope of bribe money and carefully slid the forged power of attorney into her purse. The moment she turned her back and exited my home, I locked the screen of my tablet. The physical evidence of her monumental felony was now securely preserved on a remote federal server. I stood up from my bed, rolling my broad shoulders, and officially initiated the silent adjustment. Colin strode through the polished brass doors of the downtown municipal bank with the unearned arrogance of a man who believed the world existed entirely to serve his immediate needs. He wore a sharply tailored navy suit, clutching a sleek leather folio tight against his ribs. I watched him from the tinted window of my parked truck across the busy avenue. Sullivan had tapped into the bank's appointment registry earlier that morning, providing me with the exact timeline of Colin's scheduled robbery. Colin marched directly toward the priority service desk, completely bypassing the standard teller line. He placed the freshly forged power of attorney document onto the cool marble counter with a commanding authoritative slap. He smoothly informed the senior clerk that he required an immediate cashier's check for $100,000 drawn directly from my primary retirement reserves. He cited an urgent, fabricated medical expenditure required to secure my specialized facility admission for the upcoming weekend. I tracked the digital clock on my dashboard, watching the bright red numbers tick down with absolute mechanical precision. I gave Colin exactly 3 minutes to establish his narrative and commit to the fraudulent transaction before I made my move. When the digital display shifted, I stepped out of my vehicle and crossed the sunlit pavement. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, instantly feeling the crisp, conditioned air of the financial institution wash over my face. The bank lobby was filled with morning patrons quietly conducting their daily business. Colin stood at the priority counter, tapping his expensive leather shoes against the polished tiles, waiting for the clerk to return from the vault with my stolen wealth. He ran a nervous hand through his perfectly styled hair, his posture radiating a mix of greed and severe anxiety. He was entirely focused on the transaction, entirely unaware that the man he intended to rob and medically imprison was walking directly toward him. I deliberately slouched my shoulders, shuffling my heavy work boots against the spotless floor to create the distinct, tragic appearance of a frail, deeply disoriented senior citizen. I let my jaw drop slightly, maintaining a vacant, wandering gaze as I closed the final physical distance between us. The trap was firmly primed, and Colin was standing directly in the center of the snare, completely blind to the devastating public spectacle I was absolutely about to unleash upon his fragile ego. I stepped directly behind Colin and threw my arms around his rigid shoulders, pulling him into a desperate, crushing embrace. I let out a loud, theatrical wail that instantly shattered the quiet, professional atmosphere of the bank. Colin physically recoiled, his entire body stiffening in absolute shock as he spun around to face me. I gripped his expensive suit lapels with my calloused hands, dropping to my knees slightly to amplify my performance of sheer, pathetic desperation. Tears streamed down my weathered cheeks as I loudly thanked him for risking his own life to save me. I shouted my immense gratitude, ensuring my booming voice echoed off the high marble ceilings for every single patron and employee to hear clearly. I hysterically praised my wonderful son-in-law for coming to the bank to withdraw my savings to pay off the violent, dangerous loan sharks who had been aggressively threatening to break my legs. Colin's face drained of all color, transforming into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He desperately grabbed my wrists, trying to pry my hands off his jacket while frantically shushing me. He aggressively hissed under his breath, demanding I keep my mouth shut and stop causing a scene. I ignored his terrified commands, entirely amplifying my pathetic sobbing and clinging to his waist with unyielding strength. I loudly begged him to take the $100,000 quickly before the armed men waiting in the dark alley decided to burn my house to the absolute ground. The senior clerk behind the counter froze completely, her hand hovering over the keyboard, staring at us with wide, terrified eyes. The surrounding patrons stopped their transactions, turning their undivided attention toward the deeply disturbing spectacle unfolding in the center of the lobby. Colin tried to force a reassuring smile toward the clerk, stammering a weak, pathetic excuse that I was simply confused and suffering from a severe medical episode. He aggressively yanked my arm, attempting to drag me out of the building before the situation completely imploded. I dropped my weight entirely, making myself an immovable anchor on the polished floor, wailing even louder about the fictional violent criminals. The sheer magnitude of the chaotic disturbance immediately summoned the head bank manager from his glass-enclosed office. He marched briskly forward across the lobby, flanked by 2 armed security guards, his face set in a grim expression of absolute unyielding professional concern. The bank manager stepped between Colin and my weeping form, raising his hand to halt the fraudulent transaction immediately. He possessed extensive federal training in identifying active financial coercion. He glanced at the forged power of attorney resting on the counter, then looked at my tear-stained face, and finally locked a hardened, accusatory gaze directly onto Colin. He announced in a loud, commanding voice that the bank maintained a zero-tolerance policy regarding suspected elder exploitation and criminal financial duress. With a swift, decisive keystroke, the manager flagged the entire transaction and officially froze my primary retirement account, pending a full, exhaustive review by federal banking auditors. He coldly informed Colin that the requested funds were entirely restricted and that local law enforcement would be notified of the incredibly disturbing incident. Colin's jaw dropped in absolute disbelief as he realized his crucial, desperate lifeline had just been permanently severed. He stared at the locked digital screen, completely understanding that returning to his failing venture capital firm without the stolen cash meant absolute corporate death. The armed security guards stepped forward, firmly placing their hands on Colin's shoulders and physically escorting him away from the service counter. They marched him aggressively across the lobby, parading his utter humiliation in front of the silent, judging crowd. I remained on the floor, softly thanking the manager for saving me from the imaginary loan sharks playing my fragile role until the heavy glass doors swung shut behind my furious son-in-law. I slowly stood up respectfully, accepted a cup of water from the clerk, and quietly exited the building a few minutes later. I stepped out into the bright afternoon sun and spotted Colin pacing furiously in the far corner of the expansive parking lot. I stood concealed behind a concrete pillar, watching him grip his smartphone with white knuckles. He was screaming into the receiver, his voice echoing across the hot asphalt as he updated Naomi on the catastrophic failure at the bank. His initial panic had instantly morphed into a blind, terrifying rage. I listened carefully as Colin delivered a violent, uncompromising ultimatum. He explicitly promised Naomi that if the old man spoke to anyone else or caused another public scene before the Friday deadline, he would bypass the medical transport completely and physically silence me himself. The financial trap had successfully closed, but the imminent physical danger had just escalated beyond all expectations. I sat in the dim light of my home office while the encrypted video file downloaded onto my secure laptop. Sullivan had operated with his usual terrifying efficiency. Within hours of my calculated performance at the downtown bank, he had leveraged his extensive municipal connections to subpoena the exterior security footage from the bank's parking lot. The high-definition security camera mounted directly above the automated teller machines had captured Colin perfectly. I pressed play and watched the silent digital counter tick forward. The crystal-clear audio fed directly into my headphones. Colin was pacing across the hot asphalt, his face twisted in an ugly mask of desperation and blind rage. He screamed into his smartphone, delivering a violent and uncompromising ultimatum to my daughter. He explicitly stated that if I caused another scene or attempted to communicate with anyone before the Friday deadline, he would bypass the medical transport entirely and silence me himself. He threatened physical violence, detailing exactly how he would handle a stubborn old man who stood between him and his financial salvation. I listened to the raw malice in his voice without a single flinch. The puzzle pieces of their criminal conspiracy were rapidly locking into place. I had successfully baited Colin into exposing his most dangerous intentions on a verifiable municipal server. Sullivan had already cataloged this recording alongside the forged power of attorney and the toxicological report from the emergency room. We were systematically building a watertight federal case of elder exploitation, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and steepled my fingers. Colin believed his threat was a private conversation between two desperate predators. He had no idea that his unhinged parking lot confession was currently resting comfortably inside my heavily fortified digital vault. Their initial strategy to quietly drain my retirement accounts had completely failed, blocked by the vigilant bank manager. I knew they would be forced to escalate their tactics immediately. They could no longer rely on forged signatures or silent coercion. They needed a spectacular public victory to establish my mental incompetence before the federal bank auditors arrived to dismantle Colin's failing tech firm on Friday afternoon. I closed the laptop and locked it inside my desk drawer. I prepared myself for their next inevitable strike, knowing they would arrive at my doorstep wrapped in a deceptive veneer of familial affection. The heavy knocker on my front door sounded the following evening. I checked the hidden camera feed on my tablet and watched Naomi and Colin standing on my porch. They held a beautiful gold-embossed envelope and wore perfectly tailored expressions of deep familial concern. I unlocked the brass deadbolt and let them step inside my quiet, pristine sanctuary. Realizing they could not legally drain my frozen bank accounts quietly, they had aggressively pivoted to a completely new tactical approach. Colin handed me the thick paper envelope with a deeply patronizing smile. He announced that his venture capital firm was hosting a high-profile corporate gala tomorrow night. He insisted that my presence was absolutely crucial for a major charitable presentation. Naomi placed a manicured hand over mine, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She claimed it would be a wonderful opportunity for me to leave the house and socialize with prominent business leaders. I saw directly through their transparent, highly venomous facade. Their singular goal was to parade me into a ballroom packed with wealthy real estate investors while I was heavily sedated and visibly disheveled. They needed hundreds of powerful, influential witnesses to publicly establish my absolute mental incompetence, thereby validating the forged psychiatric evaluation. I stared at the elegant invitation, feeling a profound, heavy sorrow settle deep within my chest. I remembered the grueling decades of brutal physical labor I had poured into building massive commercial properties across the city. I recalled waking up long before dawn, breaking my back, carrying heavy lumber, and pouring thick concrete until my hands bled. Every single agonizing sacrifice I made was designed exclusively to fund Naomi's elite private education and guarantee her a life free from financial hardship. I gave her the finest upbringing my sweat could purchase, desperately hoping she would inherit her mother's fierce integrity. Instead, she had absorbed nothing but the shallow, ruthless ambition of the high society she desperately craved. She was entirely willing to completely obliterate my legacy and strip away my dignity simply to maintain her opulent suburban lifestyle. I looked into her cold, calculating eyes and realized that the little girl I had carried on my shoulders was entirely gone. In her place stood a completely dangerous, desperate predator willing to sacrifice her own father to federal fraud. I smiled vaguely at the intricate gold lettering printed on the thick cardstock invitation, accepting their challenge. I accepted the glossy invitation from Colin with a slow, deliberately vacant smile, perfectly mimicking the advanced cognitive decline they so desperately needed to project. Naomi beamed with predatory satisfaction, instructing me to be ready by 7 o'clock the next evening for a private car to collect me. I nodded obediently, offering absolutely no verbal resistance whatsoever. The moment the heavy door clicked shut behind them, my submissive posture vanished entirely. I walked straight into my master bedroom and opened the very bottom drawer of my antique cedar armoire. I bypassed my tailored Italian suits and crisp silk ties, reaching instead for the heavy canvas garment resting beneath them. It was my original pair of heavy-duty carpenter overalls, deeply stained with dried white paint, hardened concrete, and the sweat of countless exhausting commercial projects. I had kept them as a silent, humble reminder of the brutal origins of my immense wealth. If Naomi and Colin wanted to present me to their elite investors as a broken, pathetic artifact of the past, I would gladly deliver an unforgettable visual masterpiece. The following evening, the private town car deposited me directly in front of the towering glass entrance of the downtown luxury hotel. I stepped onto the plush crimson carpet wearing my ruined work boots and the heavily stained canvas overalls over a faded thermal undershirt. The magnificent ballroom was a sea of glittering diamonds, sharp tuxedos, and flowing evening gowns. As I shuffled into the opulent space, the loud, arrogant chatter of the corporate elite instantly died down. The wealthy corporate guests quickly paused their sophisticated conversations, staring at my dirty working-class attire with naked, unshielded disgust. I felt their judgmental eyes sweeping over me, assessing my worth entirely by the rough texture of my clothes. Colin spotted me from across the room, his face draining of color before morphing into a mask of absolute furious mortification. Naomi gasped instinctively, covering her mouth with a jewel-encrusted hand, as the surrounding venture capitalists visibly recoiled from my presence. I lowered my chin and hunched my shoulders, allowing myself to look entirely subservient and dangerously lost in the lavish environment. Walking into a room filled with corporate sharks was an incredibly dangerous tactical maneuver, but I absolutely required this exact magnificent stage. They had unknowingly provided me with the perfect public venue to initiate a devastating, irreversible counteroffensive against their entire fraudulent empire. Colin's heavy footsteps closed the distance between us in seconds. He did not speak. He He simply clamped his hand around my bicep with a brutal, punishing grip. His fingers dug deeply into my muscle through the thick canvas of my overalls. He violently jerked me forward, dragging me away from the entrance and directly toward a tight circle of prominent real estate magnates. These were the exact banking auditors and private equity sharks Colin desperately needed to impress to save his sinking corporate empire. He aggressively pushed me into the center of their glittering circle. The investors recoiled, pulling their tailored suits away from my paint-stained clothes as if poverty were highly contagious. Colin flashed a blinding artificial smile that completely masked the absolute panic raging behind his eyes. He raised his voice, ensuring his words carried across the silent ballroom. He confidently introduced me to the wealthy elite, not as his father-in-law, but as a homeless, senile handyman his family had generously taken in off the dangerous city streets out of profound Christian pity. He spun a sickening fabricated narrative about my tragic cognitive decline and their immense charitable sacrifice. With a few calculated venomous sentences, he systematically stripped away my entire identity. He erased my decades of architectural triumphs, my grueling structural achievements, and my fundamental role as the father who had funded his wife's opulent lifestyle. I slowly turned my head toward the edge of the circle. Naomi stood perfectly still near a towering ice sculpture. She held a slender crystal flute of expensive champagne, taking a slow, deliberate sip. She did not intervene. She did not correct her husband's monstrous lie. She simply watched my public execution with cold, calculating detachment. Her absolute complicity was far more devastating than Colin's aggressive physical assault. She was entirely willing to permanently erase my existence to preserve her social standing. I stood silently beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers, completely absorbing the sheer magnitude of their vile betrayal. The elite crowd murmured their approval of Colin's fabricated philanthropy, offering him sympathetic nods and admiring glances. They completely bought the illusion of the broken, pathetic vagrant. I immediately lowered my chin against my chest, playing the role of the subservient broken vagrant to absolute perfection. I intentionally let my shoulders slump heavily, allowing a vacant, empty expression to completely overtake my features. I mumbled softly to myself, presenting the flawless image of a shattered mind completely disconnected from reality. The wealthy investors quickly lost interest in the tragic spectacle and turned their sharp attention back toward the lucrative business at hand. Colin instantly relaxed his punishing grip on my arm, deeply relieved that I was complying with his fabricated narrative. His massive ego swelled as he soaked in the unwarranted admiration of his peers. He signaled a passing waiter, plucking a fresh glass of champagne from the silver tray. He turned his broad back toward me, raising his glass high into the air to deliver a loud, arrogant toast to the future of urban development. His attention was entirely focused on the crowd, leaving his flank completely unguarded. I seized the precise window of opportunity. My hands were heavily calloused from decades of brutal manual labor, but they possessed the exact flawless precision required to set delicate architectural shims and manipulate complex structural wiring. I smoothly stepped directly into his blind spot, pressing my side against his tailored suit jacket for a fraction of a second. I swiftly slid my fingers deep into the inner breast pocket of his blazer. I felt the familiar smooth texture of his leather master investment portfolio and the thick physical ledger he carried everywhere to track his fraudulent activities. With a rapid, completely undetectable motion, I extracted the heavy documents from his coat. I instantly dropped the stolen ledger deep into the massive reinforced front pouch of my carpenter overalls. Colin continued laughing loudly at a joke from a venture capitalist completely oblivious to the fatal breach of his security. I did not linger to admire my swift handiwork. I immediately shuffled backward, melting seamlessly into the bustling crowd of caterers and event staff moving along the perimeter of the grand ballroom. The elite guests actively stepped out of my path, eager to avoid any physical contact with my ruined clothing. Their inherent prejudice provided the perfect unobstructed escape route. I pushed through the heavy brass service doors and exited the luxurious hotel entirely undetected. I stepped out into the freezing night air, carrying the absolute destruction of Colin's empire right inside my pocket. The flickering neon sign of a desolate highway diner cast long, jagged shadows across the empty parking lot. It was exactly 2 a.m. when I pushed through the battered glass doors. The air inside smelled of stale coffee and industrial bleach. Sullivan sat alone in a secluded corner booth, perfectly alert and dressed in his immaculate charcoal suit. I slid onto the cracked vinyl bench across from him and pulled the stolen leather portfolio from my canvas overalls. I dropped Colin's master investment ledger directly onto the sticky Formica table. Sullivan immediately opened the thick binder, his sharp eyes rapidly scanning the meticulous records of my son-in-law's sprawling financial fraud. The stolen documents contained everything we needed to completely obliterate his false corporate empire, but the immediate priority was securing the $18 million industrial lot. Sullivan reached into his sleek titanium briefcase and extracted a dense stack of heavily vetted legal documents. He placed them deliberately in front of me alongside a heavy gold fountain pen. He explained the precise tactical mechanics of our final maneuver. By signing these specific binding contracts, I would immediately transfer the total ownership of the massive commercial property directly into an irrevocable trust. This specific legal structure was absolutely bulletproof, designed to completely block any future claims or fraudulent transfers. The trust would be controlled exclusively by the academic foundation of a prestigious historically black college. The institution would utilize the massive fortune to fund engineering scholarships and construct advanced technology centers for underprivileged students. I picked up the heavy gold pen and stared at the crisp white pages. I was officially relinquishing all personal ownership of the asset Colin desperately needed to survive his federal audit. The moment the ink dried on the parchment, my son-in-law's violent financial conspiracy would suffer a catastrophic, unrecoverable structural collapse. He absolutely required my property to cover the fraudulent bridge loan by Friday afternoon. By giving the land away completely, I was ensuring the auditors would find nothing but empty accounts and forged collateral. I firmly pressed the pen against the paper and signed my name with sweeping, deliberate strokes. I signed away $18 million without a single fraction of hesitation or regret. I handed the executed documents back to Sullivan. The silent adjustment was now permanent, leaving Colin to face the devastating consequences of his own monumental greed. The freezing wind whipped across the desolate diner parking lot as Sullivan secured the executed trust documents inside his titanium briefcase. The ultimate financial snare was now permanently armed and completely irreversible. We stepped out into the biting cold, parting ways with a silent nod of mutual understanding. The immediate threat of the fraudulent bridge loan had been effectively neutralized, but the corresponding physical danger to my life had just spiked to an unprecedented, terrifying level. My mind raced with calculated mechanical precision as I steered my old truck back toward my quiet suburban neighborhood. I fully understood the lethal psychology of a cornered predator. When Friday afternoon finally arrived, Colin would confidently march into his venture capital firm to present the deed to the federal banking auditors. He would attempt to legally transfer the $18 million asset, only to discover that the massive industrial lot belonged exclusively to a historically black college foundation. The sudden, humiliating eradication of his corporate empire would shatter his fragile sanity. His desperate, suffocating panic would instantly ignite into uncontrollable, murderous rage. He would immediately hunt down the man responsible for his absolute financial destruction. I needed to utilize these precious remaining hours to heavily fortify my property and establish a rigorous defensive perimeter. I intended to barricade the heavy oak doors, activate the hidden surveillance grid to its maximum sensitivity, and wait for my furious son-in-law to arrive and violently incriminate himself on federal camera. The tires of my truck crunched softly against the frosted asphalt as I finally turned onto my familiar street. I slowed the vehicle to a deliberate crawl, my sharpened instincts immediately flaring with cold, undeniable alarm. The tactical situation had already shifted dramatically during my brief absence. A massive, unmarked black security vehicle was parked aggressively across the center of my concrete driveway, completely blocking the path to my garage. The exterior floodlights of my house were blazing intensely brightly, casting long, harsh shadows across the meticulously manicured lawn. I killed the engine and stepped out into the freezing darkness, my heavy work boots hitting the pavement with a dull, heavy thud. I walked cautiously up the familiar concrete pathway, the freezing night air stinging my lungs with every single breath. I was entirely prepared to face Colin's immediate wrath, but the harsh new reality waiting on my front porch was entirely fundamentally different right now. I reached the top step of my porch and instinctively reached into the deep front pocket of my heavy canvas overalls. My rough fingers closed around the familiar worn brass key I had used to unlock this exact door for the past 30 years. I stepped forward and pressed the jagged metal edge against the locking mechanism. The key refused to slide into the narrow chamber. I pulled it back and examined the heavy brass fixture under the bright glare of the porch light. The entire locking cylinder had been completely removed and professionally replaced with a high-grade commercial deadbolt. The underlying wood was freshly splintered, indicating a rapid, forceful installation. I lowered my hand slowly, the cold realization of the immediate tactical shift washing over my rigid posture. I shifted my gaze downward toward the woven welcome mat resting at my work boots. A single heavy-duty black plastic trash bag sat slumped against the pristine white doorframe. The thin plastic material was stretched taut over the sharp edges of my few remaining worldly possessions. I recognized the distinct shape of my framed wedding photograph pressing against the black vinyl discarded alongside a meager handful of folded shirts and my daily medications. The sum total of my entire existence within these walls had been ruthlessly compacted into a disposable garbage bag. Before I could process the sheer stunning audacity of the insult, the newly installed deadbolt clicked with a sharp, heavy mechanical snap. The solid oak door swung inward, revealing the brightly lit interior of the home I had built with my own bleeding hands. Naomi stood perfectly framed in the center of the doorway, clutching a steaming ceramic mug of imported herbal tea. She wore a pristine white cashmere sweater and an expression of absolute unyielding aristocratic contempt. Her posture radiated the supreme confidence of a victor who believed she had completely conquered a helpless enemy. She did not stand alone to face her father. Two massive, heavily muscled private security contractors flanked her on either side, their imposing frames effectively blocking any physical access to the interior hallway. They wore matching tactical black uniforms and stood with their thick arms crossed firmly over their chests, silently projecting the unmistakable threat of immediate physical violence. The battlefield had been violently relocated right directly onto my own front door at this very precise moment right now. Naomi took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea before offering a tight, venomous smile. She spoke with the chilling, detached efficiency of a corporate liquidator finalizing a hostile takeover. She coldly informed me that she had officially activated the comprehensive power of attorney document earlier that afternoon. Utilizing the freshly forged legal authority, she had swiftly bypassed standard real estate protocols and sold my entire property directly to a massive commercial developer for an immediate cash payout. The house no longer belonged to me. I was now legally classified as a hostile trespasser standing on foreign soil. She reached into the pocket of her cashmere sweater and extracted a cheap tarnished plastic keychain attached to a jagged metal room key. She tossed the miserable object onto the porch, watching it clatter harshly against the frozen concrete near my boots. She stated that she had generously booked a squalid, low-rent motel room on the desolate western edge of the city. She explicitly commanded me to remain locked inside that filthy room until the heavily armed medical transport unit arrived to securely collect me on Friday morning. If I attempted to return to the neighborhood or contact anyone else, her hired security contractors would violently physically restrain me until the psychiatric hold was permanently finalized. She expected me to break down completely. She anticipated loud, pathetic sobbing, desperate begging, or perhaps a futile, raging physical outburst that her guards could easily subdue. She wanted the supreme satisfaction of watching her father crawl on his knees and surrender his dignity to her absolute authority. I denied her that incredibly twisted pleasure. I kept my breathing perfectly measured and my facial muscles entirely relaxed. Without shedding a single tear or uttering a solitary syllable of protest, I slowly bent down and retrieved the cheap motel key from the freezing concrete. I firmly grasped the knotted plastic handles of the black garbage bag containing my entire life. I stood completely upright, locking my steady, unwavering gaze directly into her arrogant eyes for one long, terrifying second. I simply turned my broad back on my ruthless daughter and walked steadily away, deep into the freezing, pitch-black winter night. I did not look back at the brightly lit suburban house. My absolute, profound silence struck her like a physical blow, leaving Naomi visibly shivering and deeply, fundamentally unnerved by my chillingly calm and entirely silent departure. The motel room was cold, damp, and illuminated solely by the flickering red neon sign buzzing outside the window. Derek placed his black trash bag onto the heavily stained carpet. He completely ignored the peeling floral wallpaper and the lingering scent of stale cigarette smoke. He walked directly toward the rickety laminate desk and extracted the sleek silver laptop he had carefully concealed within his folded flannel shirts. Alongside the computer, he placed the stolen leather portfolio. He opened the heavy binder, smoothing the pages with his rough thumbs. Inside, he found exactly what he sought. It was a comprehensive, highly confidential directory containing the direct contact information for every major stakeholder, executive board member, and venture capital firm currently propping up Collins' failing software enterprise. Derek connected to the unsecured motel network, instantly masking his digital footprint through a series of encrypted virtual private networks Sullivan had established for him. He created a secure, untraceable email account. He immediately began typing. The words flowed with the precise, methodical rhythm of a master builder driving heavy steel nails into a supporting wooden beam. He was not writing an emotional manifesto or a pathetic plea for sympathy. He was drafting a highly technical, ruthlessly clinical financial exposé. He addressed the message to the entire hidden list of billionaires and institutional investors. He systematically detailed the exact nature of the emergency bridge loan Colin had desperately secured. He listed the specific calendar dates, the exact dollar amounts, and the private names of the banking officials involved in the unauthorized transaction. He meticulously explained the fundamental structural flaw in the corporate inflated market valuation. He actively weaponized the stolen private handwritten notes against Colin, directly quoting his profound internal anxieties regarding the impending Friday federal audit. Derek worked relentlessly through the freezing night, his calloused fingers striking the keyboard with unrelenting force. The ambient roar of passing cargo trucks on the nearby highway provided a steady thumping rhythm to his solitary labor. He did not feel the biting cold or the physical exhaustion. He felt only a profound, absolute focus. He was systematically dismantling a fraudulent empire brick by brick. He ensured the tone of the message remained utterly professional, entirely devoid of any personal vendetta. The communication read perfectly like an internal leak from a highly placed corporate whistleblower. He reviewed the extensive recipient list one final careful time to ensure absolute accuracy. The meticulously formatted digital document Derek compiled was a masterful work of undeniable financial destruction. He meticulously exposed the fraudulent collateral backing Collins' entire tech company, explicitly detailing exactly how the desperate executive had illegally leveraged a massive commercial industrial property he did not legally own. He meticulously outlined the specific mechanics of the forged signatures used to secure the venture capital, leaving absolutely no room for alternative interpretations or plausible deniability. To ensure the complete eradication of Collins' credibility, Derek detailed the pending federal bank investigation initiated after the highly public altercation at the downtown branch. He stated clearly that the primary retirement accounts used to artificially inflate the liquid corporate assets were currently frozen under strict federal review for suspected elder exploitation. This specific revelation guaranteed the investors would immediately recognize the severe criminal nature of the situation. Words alone, however, were entirely insufficient to trigger the immediate catastrophic panic Derek required. He needed absolute, irrefutable visual proof. He reached into his duffel bag and extracted a secure digital scanner. With practiced efficiency, he scanned the pristine, newly executed legal trust documents he had signed with Sullivan. He also uploaded perfectly clear photographs of the true original property deeds, proving unequivocally that the land belonged exclusively to the designated college foundation. He attached these devastating digital files directly to the anonymous email, creating a lethal payload of undeniable evidence. The sheer volume of verified criminal activity contained within the message was truly staggering. Derek stared at the glowing screen, his thumb hovering gently over the trackpad. He thought about the decades of backbreaking labor he had endured, the immense sacrifices he had made to provide for his daughter, and the vile, arrogant contempt she had shown him in return. They had ruthlessly attempted to strip away his dignity, his home, and his fundamental freedom simply to fund their hollow, luxurious lifestyle. They had completely underestimated the absolute resolute strength of the man who had built their entire foundation. Derek pressed the button. He hit send, instantly delivering the fatal financial blow to dozens of billionaire investors simultaneously. The heavy data packets vanished into the digital ether, completely bypassing corporate public relations teams and landing directly in the private inboxes of the powerful men and women who controlled Collins' ultimate fate. The heavy silence inside the isolated motel room remained absolute, but the final war was now permanently won. At exactly dawn, the financial markets reacted with unprecedented, unmitigated violence. The opening bell on Wall Street had barely finished ringing before Collins' heavily leveraged corporate stock completely flatlined. The meticulously documented anonymous email had spread through the elite financial sector like a highly contagious virus. Within 30 agonizing minutes, dozens of prominent billionaire investors initiated aggressive, coordinated legal maneuvers to immediately recall their massive capital contributions. The venture capital firm was suddenly facing multiple devastating federal lawsuits and an immediate catastrophic liquidity crisis. Colin stood perfectly still in his opulent glass corner office, staring at his glowing trading monitors in absolute paralyzing horror. The rapidly plummeting graphs clearly confirmed that his entire fraudulent empire was violently disintegrating right before his terrified eyes. His smartphone vibrated relentlessly against the polished mahogany desk, flooded with furious demands for immediate repayment from the exact same corporate sharks he had successfully charmed the previous night. He wildly scrolled through the leaked digital document, his frantic eyes landing on the perfectly scanned images of his own private, handwritten financial ledgers. The blood instantly drained from his face as a horrifying, undeniable realization struck him. Only one single person possessed the physical proximity and the precise opportunity to extract those specific documents during the chaotic, crowded charity gala. The supposedly senile, broken old man he had so publicly humiliated had expertly pickpocketed him. Derek was the lethal anonymous leak. The profound, sickening humiliation of being utterly outsmarted by his own discarded family completely shattered Colin's fragile, arrogant sanity. His deep underlying panic instantly morphed into a blind, murderous, and entirely uncontrollable rage. He completely abandoned his rapidly failing corporate headquarters, leaving his entirely frantic employees to face the impending federal auditors completely alone. He sprinted toward the private elevator, his breathing ragged and his fists clenched tight enough to draw blood. He was no longer trying to hide his crimes. He was actively seeking absolute violent retribution. Less than an hour later, the heavy tires of a massive black luxury vehicle screeched violently across the heavily cracked asphalt of the completely desolate motel parking lot. The heavy machine slammed into a harsh, aggressive stop directly outside Derek's designated room. The dark-tinted windows concealed the driver, but the roaring, idling engine projected a clear, unmistakable promise of immediate violence. The final, entirely inevitable physical confrontation had officially arrived right at Derek's severely weathered motel door. The flimsy wooden door of the motel room violently splintered inward with a deafening, terrifying crash. Colin stood framed in the ruined threshold, his chest heaving rapidly under his very deeply wrinkled designer suit. His face was entirely drained of color, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of a man watching his entire universe collapse. His eyes were wide and manic, darting around the dim room until they locked onto my seated figure. He did not waste time screaming or issuing threats. He crossed the stained carpet in 3 massive strides and grabbed me by the collar of my thermal shirt. He hauled me upward with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, dragging me roughly toward the freezing exterior. I stumbled intentionally, allowing my dead weight to slow his frantic pace, but his grip remained punishingly tight. He shoved me through the ruined doorway and out into the biting winter wind. The massive black luxury SUV idled aggressively just inches from the concrete walkway. The rear passenger door was already flung wide open, waiting like a steel vault. Colin threw me forward with brutal force, sending me crashing face first into the premium leather seats. I scrambled to right myself as he slammed the heavy door shut behind me, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness. He rushed around the rear of the vehicle and threw himself into the passenger seat, barking a harsh, guttural command. Naomi sat tightly behind the leather steering wheel, her knuckles completely white from her vice-like grip. Her pristine cashmere sweater was entirely disheveled, and her posture radiated absolute suffocating panic. She slammed her foot onto the accelerator, causing the heavy rear tires to screech violently against the cracked asphalt as we tore out of the desolate parking lot. The sudden acceleration threw me hard against the side door, perfectly simulating the frailty of a broken old man. Naomi navigated the sharp highway on-ramp with reckless, terrifying speed, entirely abandoning her usual aristocratic poise. She stared straight ahead, completely silent, her jaw clenched so tightly it looked ready to fracture. The interior of the rushing vehicle felt like a pressurized cabin moments before total, catastrophic failure. Colin continually checked his vibrating phone, his breathing ragged and shallow as the disastrous financial alerts flooded his screen. He twisted violently in his seat, locking his wild, bloodshot eyes onto my face with a look of absolute, highly concentrated physical hatred. The black SUV surged extremely aggressively down the interstate, weaving erratically through the dense morning commuter traffic. The towering glass spires of the central downtown financial district loomed menacingly on the distant horizon, expanding rapidly as Naomi relentlessly depressed the accelerator. The entire vehicle vibrated with the raw, terrifying energy of their impending criminal doom. Colin reached very deep into the breast pocket of his ruined suit jacket, his hands trembling violently. He swiftly retrieved a small, unmarked amber plastic vial. The frantic executive twisted the safety cap off with a sharp, aggressive snap and tipped a single massive white pill directly into his sweating palm. It was a heavily concentrated synthetic narcotic, a highly illegal chemical tranquilizer explicitly designed to obliterate human cognitive function and enforce absolute, unyielding physical compliance. He needed my mind entirely erased and my body perfectly docile so he could physically force my hand to sign whatever fraudulent institutional documents remained to save his collapsing real estate deal. Colin lunged over the center console, completely ignoring the dangerous velocity of the moving vehicle. He tightly grabbed the collar of my jacket, dragging my head forward until we were mere inches apart. I could smell the stale, sour stench of absolute financial terror radiating from his pores. He raised his free hand and brutally squeezed my cheeks forcefully, prying my jaw open with vicious, undeniable physical strength. He commanded me to swallow the sedative instantly, his voice cracking with the sheer unhinged desperation of a cornered animal facing total eradication. The heavy white pill dropped directly onto the center of my dry tongue, leaving a harsh, overwhelmingly bitter chemical residue radiating across my taste buds. I strictly maintained my perfectly calibrated facade of a frightened, confused, elderly victim. I stared up into his wild, bloodshot eyes, allowing my own gaze to appear remarkably dull and completely devoid of human understanding. Colin released his punishing grip on my jaw, aggressively wiping his sweating palm against his expensive trousers. He slumped back into the passenger seat, his chest heaving as he stared out the windshield toward the rapidly approaching corporate skyscrapers. He genuinely believed he had successfully neutralized the final obstacle standing between him and total financial salvation. He required absolute obedience, completely unaware that his desperate, violent maneuver had just provided me with the ultimate theatrical advantage for our final, highly public and utterly devastating corporate confrontation. I waited exactly 4 seconds before executing my flawless physical countermeasure. I instantly seized my own chest, violently convulsing my shoulders forward as if the dry pill had completely lodged itself deep within my throat. I erupted into a massive, highly exaggerated coughing fit, hacking loudly and gasping frantically for oxygen in the confined space of the speeding vehicle. The sudden, violent physical distress completely distracted Colin, forcing him to momentarily turn his arrogant head toward the passenger window in sheer disgust. I immediately capitalized on the fleeting, microscopic window of opportunity. Using my tongue with practiced, precise agility, I swiftly swept the heavy narcotic tablet out from the center of my mouth and tucked it securely beneath my lower gums. I continued to heave and sputter dramatically, burying my lower face deep into the crook of my elbow to muffle the loud racking noises. With a sharp, sudden exhalation, I smoothly spat the intact chemical tranquilizer directly into the heavy flannel fabric lining the inside of my sleeve. The hazardous chemical was entirely neutralized, leaving only a lingering, bitter, metallic taste washing over my palate. I slowly allowed the aggressive coughing spasms to subside, replacing the physical turmoil with a chilling, perfectly calibrated performance of overwhelming neurological collapse. I let my jaw hang slack and intentionally rolled my eyes upward, staring blankly toward the dark interior ceiling of the luxury SUV. I allowed my heavy arms to fall completely limp at my sides, my entire muscular structure melting into a puddle of absolute manufactured docility. I slowed my breathing to a shallow, rhythmic wheeze, mimicking the exact physiological signs of a patient succumbing entirely to a massive dose of commercial sedatives. Colin glanced over his shoulder, a cruel, satisfied smirk finally breaking across his pale, sweating face as he observed my deeply fabricated physical deterioration. He proudly announced to Naomi that the heavy narcotic had successfully engaged, completely paralyzing the stubborn old man's mental defenses. Naomi let out a sharp, breathless laugh of immense relief, her white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel finally relaxing as we merged onto the central downtown avenue. The extremely massive black luxury SUV smoothly decelerated, ultimately pulling into the polished circular driveway of a towering, highly secure glass skyscraper. The monumental architectural marvel stood gleaming under the morning sun, completely unaware that it was about to become the epicenter of absolute corporate destruction. Colin brutally hauled me out of the massive luxury vehicle the absolute second the idling engine shut down completely. His fingers dug deeply into my shoulder as he dragged me through the towering glass doors of the commercial skyscraper. I maintained my perfectly calibrated performance of a heavily sedated broken man. I dragged my heavy work boots across the pristine marble lobby, allowing my head to loll aimlessly. Naomi walked briskly ahead, her heels clicking sharply against the stone floor, completely ignoring the curious stares of the morning security personnel. Colin forced me into a private executive elevator and jammed his keycard into the security slot. The stainless steel doors slid shut, sealing us inside a rapidly ascending metal cage. The digital floor indicator ticked upward with silent precision, stopping abruptly at the 40th floor. Colin yanked me forward as the doors parted, shoving me directly into a cavernous, highly intimidating corporate boardroom. The space was a breathtaking monument to absolute financial power. A massive, flawlessly polished mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic commanding view of the sprawling city below. The opulent, sterile environment contrasted violently with my heavily stained canvas overalls and scuffed, ruined work boots. I stood there feigning complete neurological collapse, while a profound wave of heavy memories washed over my silent mind. Decades ago, long before this glittering tower existed, I had stood on this exact geographic coordinate. I remembered the freezing dawns spent pouring thousands of tons of wet, heavy concrete deep into the excavated earth to build the foundational bedrock for high-rises exactly like this one. I recalled the brutal, bone-crushing labor of hoisting massive steel girders into the sky, my hands bleeding and calloused, while the biting winter wind tore through my cheap thermal shirts. We were the invisible, exhausted men who physically constructed the towering monuments of the corporate elite. We sacrificed our spines and our joints so that arrogant men in tailored suits could sit comfortably behind polished mahogany and steal both the immense wealth and the unearned credit. I stared at the glossy surface of the conference table, recognizing the exact parasitic nature of the executives who inhabited these high-altitude sanctuaries. Colin was simply another ruthless suit attempting to extract a massive fortune from the sweat and blood of a vastly superior builder. 3 highly impatient real estate executives sat rigidly at the far end of the sprawling mahogany table. They wore sharply tailored, expensive suits and carried expressions of severe, unyielding corporate irritation. They aggressively demanded my immediate binding signature to finalize the catastrophic $18 million commercial land acquisition. Their entire lucrative urban development project hinged exclusively on acquiring my heavily coveted industrial property by Friday afternoon. The lead executive, a sharp-featured man with predatory eyes, leaned aggressively forward in his leather chair. He stared directly at my slumped posture, my vacant expression, and my heavily stained canvas overalls. He narrowed his eyes with distinct, highly visible legal skepticism. He loudly questioned the binding validity of the transaction, explicitly expressing severe doubt regarding my current mental competency and my legal capacity to execute a commercial transfer of this massive financial magnitude. He demanded absolute legal assurance that I fully comprehended the binding nature of the corporate contract resting on the table. Colin stiffened in pure panic, visibly sweating under the intense corporate scrutiny. Naomi seamlessly stepped forward to execute her carefully rehearsed, highly venomous tactical maneuver. She offered the skeptical executives a perfectly calibrated smile of deep, tragic, familial sorrow. She smoothly unclasped her designer leather briefcase and withdrew a crisp, official-looking document folder. She swiftly slid the heavily forged psychiatric medical evaluation directly across the polished mahogany surface. The lead executive picked up the fraudulent medical dossier, his eyes quickly scanning the fabricated psychological assessments and the counterfeit physician signatures. Naomi spoke with chilling, practiced efficiency. She calmly explained that her beloved father was suffering from rapid, irreversible cognitive decline. She falsely stated that the heavy medications required to manage my severe dementia occasionally rendered me entirely non-responsive. She pointed directly to the final page of the fraudulent medical evaluation, officially verifying my absolute legal incompetence. She coldly asserted her unyielding legal right granted by the forged power of attorney to physically assist me in signing the binding commercial real estate contracts. She presented herself as a devoted, heartbroken daughter, stepping in to fulfill the urgent financial responsibilities of a completely broken man. The executives examined the pristine forgery, their initial legal skepticism rapidly dissolving into greedy, opportunistic relief. The fabricated paperwork provided the exact, flawless legal shield they desperately required to push the highly lucrative $18 million acquisition across the finish line. The lead executive gave a curt, deeply satisfied nod of approval and slid the final binding acquisition contract directly across the smooth mahogany table. He tapped his manicured finger sharply against the yellow signature line printed at the very bottom of the crisp white page. Colin practically lunged forward, his breathing ragged with sheer, unadulterated financial desperation. He forcefully grabbed my shoulder and physically steered me toward the towering leather conference chair. He pushed me downward, forcing me to sit directly in front of the highly destructive legal document. His entire massive corporate empire rested entirely upon my compliance in this exact isolated second. Colin reached into the breast pocket of his wrinkled suit and produced an incredibly heavy polished silver fountain pen. He aggressively slammed the expensive writing instrument onto the table directly in front of my resting hands. The sharp metal clatter echoed violently throughout the cavernous, entirely silent boardroom. Colin leaned his entire upper body weight against the armrest of my chair, boxing me in completely. He lowered his head until his mouth hovered mere millimeters from my ear. He completely dropped his fake, charitable corporate persona, allowing his true, monstrous nature to bleed openly into his words. He whispered a vicious, unimaginably vile threat directly into my ear. His voice was a harsh, highly venomous hiss that perfectly masked his underlying terror. He explicitly demanded I pick up the silver pen immediately and sign my name without a single fraction of hesitation. He promised me that if I ruined this transaction, he would permanently bypass the low-rent motel and lock me inside a maximum security, heavily padded psychiatric cell for the remaining miserable decades of my life. He vowed to chemically sedate me until I entirely forgot my own name. I absorbed the brutal, unforgiving threat without breaking my heavily sedated facade. I kept my chin slumped tightly against my chest and allowed a thin line of saliva to pool at the corner of my mouth. I slowly raised my right hand, ensuring my calloused fingers trembled violently with perfectly manufactured neurological weakness. I let my hand hover over the pristine white contract, projecting the exact image of a thoroughly broken, entirely conquered victim. I slowly reached for the heavy silver pen with hesitant, intensely shaking fingers, preparing to execute the absolute final phase of their complete financial annihilation. My trembling fingers finally closed around the cold metal of the expensive silver fountain pen. Colin exhaled a hot, foul breath of profound relief against the side of my neck, genuinely believing his ultimate financial victory was finally secured. He loosened his aggressive stance, preparing to step back and play the role of the dutiful relative for his elite corporate audience. The very second his heavy hand lifted from my shoulder, my meticulously crafted performance of absolute neurological collapse vanished entirely. My right hand stopped shaking. The manufactured frailty evaporated from my muscles, replaced instantly by the dense, hardened strength of a man who had spent 4 decades wrestling structural steel. I gripped the thick silver barrel of the pen in my calloused fist like a heavy framing nail. I did not move toward the signature line on the fraudulent contract. With a sudden explosive surge of violent kinetic energy, I raised my fist and drove the heavy silver pen directly downward into the flawless mahogany conference table. The sharp metal nib punctured the expensive polished wood with a deafening violent crack. The thick silver barrel snapped completely in half under the sheer, unadulterated, brutal force of my strike. Dark black ink exploded across the pristine white pages of the binding acquisition contract, permanently destroying the heavily forged document. Colin violently flinched backward, stumbling awkwardly against a leather executive chair in absolute paralyzing shock. I pushed myself up from the table with slow, deliberate, and undeniably menacing power. I stood completely upright, stretching to my full, imposing height. I rolled my broad, heavily muscled shoulders backward, feeling the joints pop and settle into a posture of absolute, unyielding dominance. The vacant, confused fog completely disappeared from my eyes, replaced by a sharp, calculating, and predatory clarity. I stared directly at the 3 wealthy real estate executives sitting frozen at the far end of the ruined mahogany table. Their expressions of smug corporate superiority instantly dissolved into naked, unshielded terror as they realized the pathetic, broken vagrant they had just dismissed was an entirely fabricated illusion. I was no longer the helpless, completely senile victim Naomi and Colin had meticulously designed. I was the architect of their impending destruction, and the heavy, suffocating silence in the cavernous corporate boardroom belonged entirely to me. I took a deep, steady breath of the chilled, conditioned air and prepared to rapidly end this scheme. I addressed the paralyzed room with absolute clarity and perfect, unyielding articulation. My voice resonated across the vast boardroom, entirely stripping away the fabricated image of mental deterioration. I explicitly informed the three terrified real estate executives that they were actively participating in a massive criminal conspiracy. I pointed directly toward the fraudulent medical evaluation resting on the ruined mahogany surface. I stated unequivocally that every single signature, psychological assessment, and legal declaration within that pristine designer folder was a highly calculated forgery. I informed them that the commercial land they desperately sought to acquire no longer belonged to me or my family. I had legally transferred the entire $18 million property into an irrevocable academic trust just 40 hours prior to this meeting. The men in expensive suits turned completely pale, their greedy ambition instantly replaced by sheer legal panic. I turned my sharp gaze toward my daughter. Naomi stood frozen near the heavy wooden doors, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. I calmly explained to the elite corporate audience that she had utilized a fraudulently obtained legal authority to illegally liquidate my private suburban residence. She had willfully partnered with her desperate husband to systematically erase my existence and steal my lifelong financial foundation. I did not raise my voice or display any emotional distress. I simply laid out the cold, undeniable facts of their ruthless exploitation. I finally turned my attention back to Colin, who was currently trembling violently against the leather executive chair. I loudly declared that the sweating, panicking man standing beside me was actively attempting to secure millions in institutional funding through aggressive federal wire fraud. I detailed how his failing software enterprise was backed entirely by phantom collateral and empty accounts. I warned the investors that processing the acquisition document would immediately trigger a massive federal banking investigation that would inevitably pull their own lucrative equity firms into a highly publicized, deeply destructive criminal indictment. The lead executive frantically snatched the forged medical file from the table, treating the document as if it were highly radioactive. He shouted a sharp, aggressive command to his terrified colleagues, demanding they terminate the transaction and evacuate the compromised boardroom immediately. Colin realized his entire fraudulent universe was violently evaporating. The massive corporate bailout he desperately required had just transformed into a guaranteed, highly publicized federal prison sentence. He snapped completely now. Colin let out an agonizing primal roar of absolute, uncontrollable rage. His meticulously maintained corporate facade completely shattered, revealing the desperate, violent predator hiding beneath the expensive, tailored clothing. He lunged forcefully forward across the short distance, separating us, blindly attempting to physically assault me in a futile effort to permanently silence the devastating truth. His hands curled into tight, trembling fists, aiming directly for my throat. I did not retreat a single inch. I planted my heavy work boots firmly against the polished mahogany floor and shifted my body weight with practiced structural precision. I smoothly caught his incoming wrist with my calloused right hand, locking my thick fingers around his fragile bones like an industrial steel clamp. I violently twisted his arm downward, forcing him to his knees with effortless, overwhelming physical superiority. He gasped in sharp, sudden pain as his knees slammed harshly against the stone tiles. Before he could mount another pathetic, flailing attack, the heavy oak doors of the executive boardroom swung open with a massive, deafening crash. The three terrified real estate investors scrambled out of the wide entry path, pressing their expensive suits flat against the towering glass windows. Sullivan strode aggressively into the center of the chaotic room, radiating absolute, unyielding legal authority. He wore his immaculate charcoal suit and carried a thick stack of federal arrest warrants securely in his left hand. He did not arrive alone today. Two heavily armed, highly imposing federal agents flanked him closely on either side, their hands resting firmly against the black tactical weapons holstered at their hips. The sheer, overwhelming presence of federal law enforcement completely paralyzed the volatile room. Naomi let out a sharp, piercing shriek of sheer terror, dropping her designer leather briefcase onto the floor as she instinctively pressed herself into the corner. Sullivan completely ignored her pathetic display. He looked down at Colin, who was still kneeling helplessly on the floor, firmly pinned beneath my unyielding physical grip. Sullivan calmly announced that the Federal Banking Commission had officially verified the anonymous digital leak and initiated immediate catastrophic criminal proceedings against his failing corporate enterprise. The two agents stepped forward, producing heavy steel handcuffs to permanently secure the completely defeated predators. The final, entirely inescapable trap had flawlessly snapped shut today. Their sprawling, totally fraudulent empire was utterly annihilated, and my stolen dignity was finally, permanently, and absolutely restored right now. Sullivan did not waste a single second surveying the chaotic aftermath of Colin's pathetic physical assault. He stepped directly over my kneeling, subdued son-in-law and marched straight toward the far end of the sprawling mahogany conference table. The three real estate executives shrank back into their premium leather chairs, their previous corporate arrogance entirely eradicated by the overwhelming presence of armed federal law enforcement. Sullivan unlatched his sleek titanium briefcase with a sharp, echoing snap that commanded absolute silence throughout the cavernous room. He reached inside and extracted a thick, officially bound legal dossier bearing the heavy raised seal of the federal court. With a swift, incredibly deliberate motion, he slammed the certified copy of the irrevocable trust directly onto the ruined surface of the table. The heavy document landed right beside the shattered pieces of Colin's silver fountain pen and the ink-stained acquisition contracts. Sullivan squared his shoulders and addressed the terrified investors with a cold, unrelenting authority that completely dominated the physical space. He explicitly informed the executives that the $18 million industrial property they were currently attempting to purchase was entirely unavailable for any commercial transaction. He pointed a firm, accusatory finger directly at the bound trust document, meticulously explaining the exact legal reality of the situation. Sullivan announced that the coveted land currently belonged exclusively to the academic foundation of a historically black college, locked safely inside an impenetrable, federally recognized trust. He looked each executive directly in the eye, stating unequivocally that absolutely no one in this room possessed the legal authority to authorize a sale. He detailed how Colin had willfully orchestrated a massive, highly illegal deception, deliberately presenting a phantom asset to secure fraudulent institutional funding. Sullivan clarified that any signature placed on those acquisition contracts would instantly implicate their respective venture capital firms in a deeply destructive, highly publicized federal wire fraud conspiracy. The sheer magnitude of the averted disaster washed over the three businessmen instantly. They stared at the certified trust document as if it were a highly explosive device, realizing they had been mere seconds away from signing away millions of dollars to a desperate, unhinged criminal. Sullivan's flawless, perfectly timed legal execution completely neutralized the financial threat, permanently severing Colin's final fragile lifeline to corporate survival. The trap had successfully neutralized the predators, leaving the entire fraudulent acquisition completely and irreversibly dead in the extremely dark corporate water. The lead real estate executive immediately bolted entirely upright from his premium leather chair, his sharply tailored suit visibly trembling with profound professional terror. The catastrophic realization that his prestigious firm had been actively drawn into a massive criminal conspiracy struck him with the devastating force of a physical blow. He shot a look of pure, unadulterated hatred toward Colin, recognizing instantly that the desperate software CEO had intended to utilize their vast corporate wealth to blindly absorb his own monumental federal liabilities. Without uttering a single syllable of hesitation, the furious executive violently snatched the ink-stained acquisition contracts directly off the polished mahogany surface. He aggressively fed the thick binding documents directly into the heavy industrial shredder positioned silently in the corner of the sprawling boardroom. The harsh, grinding mechanical noise filled the cavernous space as millions of dollars in fraudulent potential evaporated into worthless paper ribbons. He turned back toward the paralyzed room and loudly announced that his formidable legal team would be filing massive, utterly destructive civil lawsuits against Colin's tech company by the end of the afternoon. The remaining two executives vigorously nodded their absolute agreement, rapidly gathering their designer briefcases and aggressively marching toward the heavy oak doors, completely abandoning the radioactive negotiation. As the furious businessmen evacuated the compromised territory, the two heavily armed federal agents moved decisively forward with flawless tactical precision. They efficiently bypassed the shattered conference table and approached Colin, who remained helplessly pinned against the cold stone floor beneath my unyielding grip. I slowly stepped backward, finally releasing my punishing hold on his bruised wrists, allowing the professionals to execute their designated duties. The taller federal agent aggressively grabbed Colin by his tailored collar, hauling the completely defeated executive roughly to his trembling feet. The agent violently wrenched Colin's arms behind his back, securing his wrists with a pair of cold, heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp mechanical clicking of the locking mechanism echoed loudly across the silent room, sounding exactly like a final, inescapable death knell for his entire fraudulent empire. The second agent stood perfectly rigid, loudly and meticulously reading Colin his official Miranda rights for committing major financial crimes, extensive wire fraud, and severe elder exploitation. Colin simply slumped forward against the agent's grip, his tear-streaked face completely drained of its former arrogant superiority, realizing his entirely opulent corporate luxury lifestyle was now permanently finished, here today, forever. Naomi watched the brutal, unyielding reality of her husband's immediate federal incarceration unfold with absolute, unmitigated terror. She violently backed away from the center of the chaotic boardroom, pressing her trembling spine completely flat against the towering glass window. The pristine, sweeping skyline of the affluent city she had so viciously coveted now provided a deeply ironic backdrop to her total, undeniable ruin. The heavy steel handcuffs clicking shut around Colin's bruised wrists shattered her final remaining illusion of absolute corporate invincibility. She let out a sharp, agonizing wail of pure desperation, her pristine cashmere sweater severely wrinkled as she began weeping utterly hysterically. The sheer weight of the impending federal indictments entirely crushed her former aristocratic composure, forcing her to violently drop down onto her shaking, bruised knees. Ignoring the sharp pain radiating through her legs, she frantically scrambled forward across the polished stone tiles, crawling directly toward the heavy work boots of the father she had so ruthlessly attempted to discard. Naomi stopped mere inches from my heavily stained canvas overalls, gazing upward through a dense, blinding stream of pathetic, panicked tears. She violently grasped the heavy fabric of my pant leg, her manicured fingers digging desperately into the rough material. She began to sob uncontrollably loudly, pleading for my immediate paternal intervention to somehow miraculously save her from the rapidly approaching federal agents. She wildly attempted to completely absolve herself of any criminal responsibility, tearfully claiming that Colin had severely manipulated her fragile emotional state to facilitate the massive financial forgery. She desperately attempted to weaponize my fundamental paternal instincts, begging me to remember the innocent little girl I had once fiercely protected. She practically choked on her own frantic words, swearing absolute, unwavering future loyalty if I would simply order Sullivan to formally withdraw the devastating criminal charges. I stood perfectly still beneath the glowing crystal chandeliers, staring directly downward into her wide, utterly terrified eyes. The young woman kneeling pathetically on the cold floor was a complete stranger, entirely devoid of the fierce integrity her mother had possessed. I did not reach down to offer her the slightest fraction of comfort or unearned forgiveness. I maintained my rigid, utterly unyielding posture, allowing the heavy, absolute silence to serve as my final, undeniable judgment. I simply watched the second federal agent step forward to systematically place her trembling wrists in cold, heavy iron restraints right now. Colin felt the cold steel of the federal restraints biting into his bruised wrists, and his survival instincts instantly overrode whatever fragile loyalty he held for his wife. He thrashed wildly against the tight grip of the towering federal agent and frantically locked his panicked eyes onto Sullivan. Sweat poured down his pale face as he began to loudly and aggressively negotiate for his own pathetic survival. He screamed across the cavernous boardroom that he was entirely willing to completely cooperate with the Federal Banking Commission if they guaranteed him a substantially reduced prison sentence. Without a single breath of hesitation, Colin viciously turned on Naomi. He explicitly stated that the entire criminal enterprise was exclusively her malicious design. He pointed his restrained hands toward his kneeling wife and loudly declared that she had personally orchestrated the elaborate medical forgery to steal the $18 million industrial property. He rapidly confessed that the forged signatures on the psychiatric evaluation were purchased directly through her extensive elite social network. The terrified software executive did not stop at financial fraud. He desperately sought to offer the federal agents a far more sinister and highly destructive revelation to secure his own immunity agreement. He loudly proclaimed that Naomi had actively attempted to permanently destroy her father by systematically lacing his daily herbal tea with a highly concentrated, heavily toxic chemical solvent. He painted a horrifying picture of a deeply ruthless woman deliberately poisoning her own flesh and blood to accelerate the fabricated dementia diagnosis. He insisted that the fake psychiatric hold and the squalid motel room imprisonment were entirely her deeply vindictive ideas. He eagerly offered to provide the investigators with the exact dates, times, and hidden digital receipts proving her absolute culpability in the attempted chemical assault. He threw his wife directly to the federal wolves with a breathtaking, unadulterated cowardice. He begged the silent agents to record his immediate verbal confession, desperately promising to testify against her in any federal courtroom they demanded. He completely stripped away their polished, wealthy suburban facade, revealing the absolute rot at the core of their opportunistic union. He was entirely willing to watch the mother of his children face decades behind reinforced concrete walls if it meant shaving a few miserable years off his own inevitable federal incarceration. His desperate, echoing voice filled the room with pure betrayal. He abandoned her completely today, right now. Naomi let out a sharp, ear-piercing shriek of furious, unadulterated disbelief as her husband's treacherous words echoed throughout the massive corporate boardroom. Her meticulously constructed aristocratic poise shattered into a million jagged pieces, replaced instantly by the raw, animalistic fury of a completely cornered predator. The devastating realization that her chosen partner was eagerly throwing her into a federal prison cell to save his own pathetic skin entirely eradicated any remaining shred of her cultivated elegance. She scrambled violently up from the polished stone floor, her designer heels slipping wildly against the smooth mahogany surface. With a guttural, completely unhinged scream, she aggressively lunged directly at Colin. Her hands curled into rigid, vicious claws as she recklessly hurled her entire body weight toward his restrained, terrified figure. She viciously slashed her perfectly manicured fingernails across his sweating, panicked face, instantly tearing deep, bleeding gashes into his pale cheek before the shocked federal agents could successfully intervene. The cavernous boardroom instantly descended into absolute chaotic physical violence, as the toxic, greed-driven foundation of their opportunistic marriage was brutally laid bare for everyone to clearly witness. The two heavily armed federal agents immediately rushed forward to physically separate the vicious, violently thrashing couple. The taller agent brutally tackled Colin backward against the heavy glass window, aggressively pinning the screaming software executive firmly against the sturdy architectural frame. The second agent grabbed Naomi firmly around her waist, forcefully dragging the wildly kicking woman backward across the expensive carpet. She thrashed relentlessly against his unyielding physical grip, spitting incredibly vile, highly venomous insults directly at the man she had sworn to love. She loudly accused Colin of being a pathetic, entirely incompetent failure who had successfully squandered her precious youth and completely destroyed their massive suburban empire. Colin furiously screamed right back, brutally mocking her superficial materialism and loudly declaring her a parasitic, deeply greedy burden. They tore each other apart with ruthless, deeply personal cruelty, actively exposing decades of hidden resentment and profound mutual hatred. Their luxurious, pristine suburban facade completely melted away, leaving only two pathetic, entirely broken criminals desperately clawing at each other in the terrifying shadow of their impending federal incarceration. The beautiful, opulent room was entirely consumed by their ugly, deafening shrieks of pure, undeniable defeat. Their magnificent, towering kingdom of lies had finally crashed violently downward. They would spend their miserable lives locked inside cold, unforgiving steel cages. I stood perfectly still near the shattered mahogany table, watching the miserable, degrading spectacle unfold without a single shred of paternal pity. The young woman violently thrashing against the federal agent was entirely unrecognizable to me now. She was completely devoid of the fierce integrity and honor I had desperately tried to instill in her. She had willingly chosen a life of ruthless, shallow greed, and she was finally reaping the exact devastating harvest she had sown. I slowly reached up with my calloused hands and deliberately adjusted the collar of my heavy canvas overalls. I turned away from the chaotic scene and offered Sullivan a firm, deeply respectful nod of immense gratitude. The brilliant attorney simply nodded back, his sharp eyes already scanning the ruined room for his subsequent legal maneuvers. I pivoted on my worn work boots and began walking steadily toward the heavy oak doors, my posture radiating absolute, unwavering freedom. Naomi spotted my quiet departure through her blinding tears, her sheer panic instantly skyrocketing. She wildly threw her head backward, screaming my name with a harsh, agonizing desperation that echoed violently across the cavernous corporate boardroom. She loudly begged her father to come back, pleading frantically for one final miraculous act of unearned salvation. I did not break my steady, measured stride. I did not turn around to witness her ultimate pathetic collapse. I pushed through the heavy brass handles of the executive doors, leaving the toxic, ruined predators completely behind me in the sterile corporate vault. The massive wooden barriers swung shut with a sharp, heavy mechanical click, permanently sealing away the darkest chapter of my entire existence. I stepped into the brightly lit, entirely silent carpeted hallway, finally breathing the crisp, clean air of absolute victory. My heavy boots moved rhythmically toward the private glass elevator. Before I could press the glowing call button, my cellular phone vibrated sharply inside the deep front pocket of my overalls. I pulled the device out and answered the call. Sullivan's voice crackled through the tiny speaker with urgent, crisp professional efficiency. He quickly informed me that the corrupt municipal notary who had explicitly facilitated the forged property documents had just been spotted at the International Airport terminal. The desperate public official was actively attempting to flee the country right now. The final loose end desperately required my immediate, undivided physical attention. I could not let him escape. I firmly pressed the glowing screen of my cellular phone against my ear, listening to the rapid, highly urgent breathing of the formidable attorney on the other end of the secure line. Sullivan rapidly articulated the escalating situation, explaining that the corrupt municipal notary had utilized his vast illicit financial reserves to purchase a last-minute first-class ticket on a direct outbound flight to a non-extradition jurisdiction. The desperate criminal was merely minutes away from permanently evading federal justice. I did not panic or lose my carefully maintained composure. I calmly instructed Sullivan to immediately access the highly encrypted cloud storage server containing the absolute totality of my private surveillance data. During the initial highly invasive breach of my suburban home by Naomi and Colin, my concealed digital cameras had flawlessly captured the explicit, high-definition visual and audio evidence of the municipal notary actively participating in the malicious forgery. The pristine digital footage clearly displayed the corrupt official aggressively stamping the fraudulent power of attorney documents while openly discussing his substantial illegal compensation. Sullivan accessed the remote server with blinding speed, his keyboard clicking frantically through the speaker. He quickly isolated the exact, completely undeniable video file and immediately established a direct, high-priority emergency channel with the central command hub of the Federal Airport Security Division. The undeniable high-definition evidence of massive federal wire fraud and severe elder exploitation was instantly transmitted directly to the lead federal magistrate. Within a mere fraction of a single second, a highly expedited, completely undeniable federal arrest warrant was officially generated and aggressively dispatched to the heavily armed tactical units currently stationed at the International Departure Terminal. Sullivan confidently assured me that the tactical net was already snapping tightly shut around the desperate fugitive. I remained standing perfectly still in the sterile, brightly lit corporate hallway, feeling the absolute weight of decades of hard, unyielding labor finally paying off. The precise, meticulously calculated trap I had spent weeks silently designing was now independently executing its final, highly destructive maneuvers. I stepped into the private glass elevator and pressed the ground floor button, watching the opulent financial district blur past the transparent walls. The municipal notary genuinely believed his illicit corporate payout would successfully finance a luxurious international escape. He was completely unaware that his heavily funded departure was about to violently transform into a highly publicized, deeply humiliating federal incarceration right at this exact moment. The corrupt municipal notary stood confidently at the extremely busy, luxurious international departure gate, entirely convinced he had successfully outsmarted the rigid federal justice system. He casually handed his premium boarding pass to the smiling airline attendant, completely unaware of the massive tactical strike force rapidly converging on his exact geographical coordinate. 4 heavily armed undercover federal agents suddenly emerged from the dense crowd of unsuspecting tourists, moving with absolute flawless military precision. The lead agent forcefully grabbed the terrified notary by the collar of his expensive designer jacket, brutally slamming him face first against the polished glass wall of the boarding terminal. Hundreds of entirely shocked civilian passengers violently gasped and stepped backward, watching the spectacular public takedown unfold with pure, unadulterated astonishment. The federal agents violently wrenched the screaming official's arms behind his back, securing his wrist with thick, heavy iron restraints. The arrogant criminal immediately collapsed into a puddle of pure, absolute terror, loudly begging the stone-faced officers for immediate legal leniency. He frantically realized his lucrative corporate escape plan had just violently evaporated, permanently replaced by the terrifying prospect of spending his remaining miserable decades inside a maximum-security federal penitentiary. Desperate to save his own pathetic skin, the weeping notary instantly abandoned his toxic loyalty to Naomi and Colin. He frantically screamed that he possessed physical, undeniable proof of a massive, sprawling criminal syndicate currently operating directly within the city. He aggressively bartered for a reduced sentence by eagerly offering up his most highly protected illicit asset. The panicking official explicitly directed the federal agents to a secret, hidden compartment seamlessly stitched into the lining of his expensive leather carry-on suitcase. The lead agent forcefully ripped the premium fabric apart, immediately extracting 2 heavily encrypted portable hard drives. The trembling notary loudly confessed that the digital drives contained an absolute treasure trove of highly illegal documentation spanning an entire uninterrupted decade. He frantically explained that the files explicitly detailed thousands of highly malicious forgeries directly involving the corrupt psychiatric clinic doctor who had falsely diagnosed my completely fabricated cognitive decline. He ruthlessly threw his wealthy co-conspirators directly to the federal wolves, desperately attempting to leverage their mutual destruction to somehow miraculously mitigate his own severe criminal punishment. The massive, sprawling network of organized elder exploitation was fundamentally compromised, entirely gutted from the inside out by a terrified coward seeking absolute unearned federal salvation right here today perfectly. Armed with the utterly devastating digital evidence extracted directly from the cowardly notary, a heavily militarized tactical unit forcefully descended upon the highly exclusive private psychiatric clinic. The sprawling, impeccably manicured medical compound had long served as the absolute epicenter for a massive, highly lucrative criminal enterprise specifically designed to systematically exploit vulnerable, wealthy seniors. The elite federal agents aggressively shattered the pristine tranquility of the opulent marble lobby, their heavy tactical boots thundering violently across the expensive imported flooring. The utterly corrupt chief medical physician, the exact same arrogant professional who had maliciously rubber-stamped my completely fabricated dementia diagnosis without ever performing a single legitimate psychological assessment, stood frozen in absolute terror behind his polished mahogany reception desk. He had spent his entire lucrative career hiding comfortably behind the highly respected shield of his prestigious medical credentials, genuinely believing his immense wealth provided an impenetrable barrier against federal justice. His arrogant facade instantly evaporated as the lead tactical commander loudly marched forward, violently slamming the terrified doctor directly against the ornate reception counter. The aggressive physical impact sent expensive crystal decorations crashing violently onto the hard stone floor, perfectly symbolizing the rapid, undeniable destruction of his illicit medical empire. The commander loudly read the trembling physician his official federal Miranda rights, aggressively securing his bruised wrists in heavy steel handcuffs, while explicitly announcing the immediate permanent revocation of his highly esteemed medical license. In a single violently chaotic afternoon, the entire sprawling network of organized elder exploitation completely crumbled into worthless dust. The malicious, highly coordinated predators who had eagerly conspired to steal my massive industrial property and legally erase my fundamental human independence were systematically dragged away in absolute, undeniable disgrace. They would spend their remaining decades locked inside freezing, heavily fortified federal prison cells, thoroughly stripped of their stolen wealth and unearned societal prestige. I walked out of the towering corporate skyscraper and stepped directly onto the bustling, brightly lit city sidewalk, feeling the freezing winter wind wash cleanly over my exhausted face. The incredibly dense, suffocating, and totally exhaustive legal battle was finally permanently won. I had successfully defended my massive financial legacy and entirely neutralized the vicious predators seeking to completely consume my entire existence. However, as I stared blankly toward the massive, endlessly stretching urban horizon, I realized the most difficult, profoundly painful emotional trial was only just beginning right now, completely, entirely, forever. 6 exact months evaporated since the coordinated federal raids systematically dismantled the sprawling criminal syndicate. The towering municipal courthouse stood as a stark, profoundly imposing fortress of absolute legal judgment. Heavy oak paneling and freezing marble floors created a sterile, entirely unforgiving environment designed to strip away all earthly illusions. I sat heavily inside the elevated wooden witness box, the polished railing digging uncomfortably into my calloused forearms. The ambient temperature felt brutally cold, perfectly mirroring the absolute desolation echoing deep within my chest. I stared directly across the cavernous room toward the defense table. Naomi sat rigidly beside her expensive legal counsel. She wore a modest, entirely fabricated beige suit designed to project an aura of innocent vulnerability. Her wrists were hidden from view, though I knew they bore the invisible permanent scars of heavy steel federal restraints. The suffocating silence of the courtroom violently triggered a massive, deeply agonizing tidal wave of buried memories. I remembered the exact blindingly bright summer morning she was born. I recalled holding her incredibly fragile, tiny body against my chest in the sterile maternity ward. I had made a silent, utterly unbreakable vow to shield her from the inherent cruelty of the world. I promised to construct an impenetrable fortress of unconditional love and absolute financial security around her entire existence. I spent 4 decades sacrificing my spine, working grueling, bone-crushing shifts in freezing weather to fulfill that sacred paternal oath. I built a massive suburban empire specifically to ensure she would never experience the bitter sting of poverty or desperation. Every drop of sweat I shed was an active investment in her pristine, privileged future. Now I sat elevated before a solemn federal jury, preparing to deliver the exact testimony required to permanently lock my only child inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. The sheer, unadulterated irony of my current geographical position tasted like bitter ash across my dry palate. The protective fortress I had meticulously built for her had been aggressively twisted into a devastating weapon used to eradicate my existence. I was no longer the fierce protector warding off external monsters. I was the primary prosecution witness forced to publicly slay the monster she had willingly become. The heavy, unforgiving wooden gavel cracked sharply against the judge's elevated podium, instantly shattering my painful, nostalgic reverie. The brutal, entirely unavoidable trial for my daughter's absolute freedom was officially commencing right now. Naomi's high-priced defense attorney approached the wooden witness stand with calculated, aggressive hostility. He was a sharp, immaculately dressed man, explicitly hired to completely dismantle my personal credibility and salvage her ruined reputation. He leaned forward, gripping the wooden railing tightly, and launched into a furious, highly theatrical interrogation designed to manipulate the silent jury. He explicitly attempted to paint me as a vindictive, wildly controlling patriarch who simply could not handle losing absolute authority over his adult daughter. His voice echoed harshly across the cold marble room, dripping with manufactured moral outrage. He loudly accused me of deliberately orchestrating this entire catastrophic legal situation to completely ruin Naomi's life out of sheer, unadulterated spite. He aggressively gestured toward her trembling figure, portraying her as an innocent, deeply misunderstood victim of my supposedly tyrannical financial oversight. He viciously twisted the undeniable facts, claiming I had intentionally fabricated the elaborate undercover sting operation simply because I disapproved of her corporate marriage to Colin. He completely ignored the forged documents, the heavily doctored psychiatric evaluations, and the stolen property deeds. Instead, he relentlessly attacked my fundamental character. He demanded to know with a sharp, highly accusatory tone why I did not simply confront my daughter privately in the comfortable privacy of our suburban home. He loudly questioned why a supposedly loving father would actively invite armed federal agents and devastating criminal indictments to resolve what he explicitly categorized as a simple, highly emotional family dispute. He paced violently back and forth across the polished courtroom floor, performing a masterful illusion of righteous indignation for the captivated jurors. He repeatedly insisted that my drastic, highly destructive legal retaliation was entirely disproportionate to her actions, desperately attempting to shift the heavy burden of guilt entirely onto my broad shoulders. He framed my flawless tactical defense as an act of pure, inexcusable malice, demanding I publicly justify my refusal to handle the massive financial betrayal privately. He continuously badgered me, firing rapid, highly aggressive questions without allowing a single fraction of a second for a response. He firmly believed his overwhelming theatrical aggression would successfully intimidate the elderly construction worker sitting in the wooden box. He genuinely thought he could legally bully me into expressing regret or hesitation. He was completely unaware that my internal emotional foundation was entirely composed of impenetrable hardened steel, and his loud, desperate performance was entirely useless against absolute truth. I waited for the exceptionally aggressive defense attorney to completely exhaust his hostile theatrical tirade before I finally reacted today. I slowly leaned my heavy frame directly into the small black microphone positioned on the wooden railing. I did not speak with the burning, explosive anger he desperately wanted to provoke. I spoke with a profound, unyielding, and utterly devastating sorrow that instantly commanded the absolute attention of every single person present. I locked my eyes directly onto the silent jurors and methodically detailed the exact circumstances of my brutal eviction. I explicitly described the freezing, deeply agonizing winter night my own daughter intentionally locked me out of the warm suburban fortress I had built with my own bleeding hands. I calmly explained that a private, quiet confrontation would have completely failed to alter her malicious trajectory. I stated with chilling, absolute clarity that confronting her privately would have merely served as an incredibly convenient early warning, granting her the vital opportunity to accelerate her fraudulent paperwork and permanently destroy my financial existence. I detailed how she willfully participated in securing counterfeit psychiatric diagnoses, explicitly intending to strip away my fundamental human autonomy and lock me inside a sterile medical prison until the day I died. I did not raise my voice, but the heavy, stoic resonance of my heartbreaking testimony struck the silent courtroom like a massive physical blow. The raw, undeniable agony of a father forced to acknowledge the complete moral rot of his only child completely obliterated the attorney's slick, highly manufactured narrative. The pristine illusion of a simple, tragic familial misunderstanding instantly evaporated under the crushing weight of undeniable, premeditated betrayal. I explained that she had entirely stopped being my daughter the exact second she looked at my life and saw only a highly profitable financial liquidation. The entire jury panel sat in profoundly stunned absolute silence, their expressions radiating a mixture of sheer horror and deep, undeniable sympathy. The defense attorney slowly backed away from the wooden podium, his aggressive posture completely collapsing as he realized his expensive legal strategy was utterly destroyed. My unyielding, perfectly composed testimony successfully buried the final nail deeply into the coffin of her desperate defense. The massive legal war was now conclusively finished in this very room, entirely securing the harsh, deeply tragic justice that her absolute, unadulterated greed had made absolutely and totally inevitable today, forever, right now. The heavy wooden doors of the jury deliberation room remained sealed for a fraction of the anticipated duration. The 12 men and women tasked with determining the absolute trajectory of my daughter's existence required less than 3 hours to reach their final, irreversible conclusion. The sudden flashing of the bailiff's signal light sent a profound shockwave of kinetic energy ripping through the utterly silent courtroom. Spectators scrambled to retake their polished wooden benches while the defense attorneys furiously whispered last-minute, entirely futile assurances to their trembling clients. I sat perfectly still in the front row of the gallery, maintaining my rigid, uncompromising posture. Colin stared blankly at the scarred surface of the defense table, his manicured hands sweating profusely. Naomi gripped the edge of her seat, her knuckles completely white, her fabricated beige suit now hanging awkwardly over her entirely defeated frame. The heavy door swung open, and the jurors filed into their elevated box with solemn, unyielding expressions. They refused to cast a single sympathetic glance toward the defense table, permanently sealing the psychological fate of the accused before a single syllable was spoken. The federal judge struck his heavy wooden gavel, demanding absolute silence from the intensely electrified room. He instructed the jury foreperson to stand and formally deliver the binding legal judgment. The foreperson, a tall, imposing woman with an incredibly steady voice, rose smoothly to her feet. She held the crisp, white verdict form tightly in her hands. The cavernous marble space grew so suffocatingly quiet that the rushing blood in my ears sounded like a deafening roar. She locked her eyes directly onto the judge and began reading the devastating outcome with surgical, unapologetic precision. Regarding the primary federal charges of massive corporate conspiracy, she declared both defendants absolutely guilty. Regarding the secondary highly destructive charges of executing extensive federal wire fraud to unlawfully secure institutional funding, she declared both defendants absolutely guilty. Finally, regarding the deeply malicious, highly calculated charges of severe elder exploitation and medical forgery, her voice rose with sharp, undeniable conviction. She declared Colin and Naomi entirely and undeniably guilty on all remaining counts. The words struck the silent room like a sequence of heavy physical blows. The flawless, completely impenetrable facade of their affluent suburban empire was instantly and permanently eradicated, replaced by the crushing, undeniable reality of their absolute criminal conviction occurring here in the courtroom today, right now. The federal judge adjusted his heavy dark robes and stared downward from his elevated wooden podium with an expression of absolute judicial severity. He explicitly addressed the completely ruined couple standing rigidly before the bench. He loudly condemned their highly calculated, entirely malicious actions, officially categorizing their elaborate financial scheme as a profound moral failure and a disgusting betrayal of fundamental familial trust. He turned his unforgiving gaze directly toward Colin, actively dismantling the arrogant software executive with surgical legal precision. The judge explicitly detailed the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic federal wire fraud and the profound devastation intended by the medical forgery. Without a single fraction of judicial mercy, he aggressively sentenced Colin to a staggering 15 consecutive years inside a maximum security federal prison facility. He explicitly stipulated that the severe, unyielding sentence mandated the complete removal of any potential opportunity for early parole or conditional release. Colin instantly collapsed backward into his heavy wooden chair, his pale face draining of all remaining blood as the terrifying reality of spending his next 15 years locked inside a sterile steel cage violently consumed his shattered mind. The judge then shifted his formidable, piercing gaze directly onto my daughter. Naomi trembled violently, her entire body shaking uncontrollably beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. The judge explicitly admonished her for actively weaponizing her own father's unconditional love, systematically exploiting a lifetime of paternal devotion purely for excessive financial gain. He methodically calculated the massive damages resulting from the forged trust documents and the highly malicious psychiatric deception she had eagerly facilitated. With a cold, entirely resolute voice, he formally sentenced Naomi to an agonizing 8 consecutive years inside a secure federal correctional institution. The absolute, undeniable reality of her completely ruined existence finally crashed downward upon her shaking shoulders with the crushing, inescapable velocity of a massive freight train. Her luxurious, highly privileged suburban fantasy instantly evaporated permanently, replaced by the terrifying certainty of cold iron bars and coarse prison uniforms. She let out a sharp, agonizing wail of pure, unadulterated devastation, entirely abandoning her meticulously fabricated posture of innocent victimhood. The heavy, unyielding gavel struck the polished wooden block one final echoing time, permanently cementing their disastrous legal fate. The brutal, unforgiving mechanism of federal justice had flawlessly executed its uncompromising mandate, leaving 2 thoroughly destroyed predators weeping pathetically in the center of the cold marble room completely and entirely right now. 2 burly federal bailiffs immediately stepped forward, firmly grasping Naomi by her trembling arms to begin her long, agonizing procession out of the sterile courtroom. She violently resisted their unyielding physical guidance, dragging her expensive designer shoes aggressively across the polished marble floor. They forcefully escorted her toward the heavy, secure holding area, placing her directly behind a thick, impenetrable pane of reinforced separation glass. Naomi pressed her tear-streaked face violently against the cold, smudged, transparent barrier, desperately seeking my unwavering gaze one final time. She wildly hammered her bound fists against the solid glass, emitting a series of harsh, muffled shrieks that barely penetrated the heavy acoustic seal. She frantically begged me for unearned forgiveness, pleading hysterically for one single, validating final embrace to miraculously erase the horrific reality of her complete betrayal. She desperately wanted her father to somehow magically fix the entirely broken universe she had maliciously created. I slowly stood up from the wooden gallery bench, my heavy work boots planting firmly onto the cold stone floor. I walked steadily toward the secure partition, closing the agonizing physical distance between us. I stood mere inches from the thick glass, staring directly into her wild, deeply panicked eyes. I saw the absolute terror radiating from her shivering frame, and I explicitly acknowledged the profound, undeniable reality of her falling tears. I looked at the pathetic, entirely ruined woman she had willfully become, completely recognizing the absolute destruction of my lifelong paternal dream. I did not raise my calloused hand to comfort her through the cold barrier. I did not utter a single syllable of empty, meaningless reassurance. I simply absorbed the brutal visual finality of her incarceration, securing the tragic image deep within my heavily scarred memory. With deliberate, uncompromising precision, I silently turned my broad shoulders and presented my back to her frantic, weeping form. I walked steadily toward the heavy wooden exit doors, my footsteps echoing loudly across the entirely silent courtroom. Naomi's muffled, agonizing screams faded rapidly as the massive brass handle clicked heavily shut behind me. I stepped into the brightly lit, entirely deserted institutional corridor, instantly enveloped by a profound, suffocating emptiness. I had flawlessly executed my defensive strategy and completely eradicated the vicious corporate predators. I faced the terrifying absolute silence of an aging man who had conclusively won the massive legal war, but permanently lost his entire family forever today. I pushed the heavy brass key into the front door of my reclaimed suburban home and stepped over the familiar threshold. The immediate suffocating silence of the empty house struck me with the physical force of a swinging hammer. For 4 decades, this structure had echoed with the vibrant, chaotic sounds of a growing family and the relentless pursuit of a prosperous future. Now the absolute stillness hung over the pristine living room like a heavy, suffocating woolen blanket. I walked slowly across the polished hardwood floors, my heavy work boots thudding rhythmically against the dense silence. I paused in front of the large mantel where a collection of silver-framed photographs still stood in perfect, undisturbed rows. I stared directly at a picture of Naomi from her high school graduation, capturing a fleeting moment of manufactured innocence before the corrosive rot of extreme greed entirely consumed her soul. The agonizing sting of profound, undeniable grief flared violently deep within my chest. I realized with absolute terrifying clarity that remaining paralyzed within this sterile museum of broken memories would systematically eradicate my sanity. Mourning the beautiful, fiercely loyal daughter I never truly possessed would silently destroy my remaining years far faster than any toxic chemical solvent they had maliciously poured into my morning tea. I could not allow their profound betrayal to permanently anchor me to a miserable, entirely defeated past. I refused to let the crushing weight of their federal incarceration transform my hard-earned freedom into a completely isolated psychological prison. I reached forward and systematically laid every single silver frame face down against the cold stone mantel, permanently breaking the visual tether to my ruined biological family. The sharp, decisive clatter of the falling frames echoed loudly across the empty space, serving as a definitive, unyielding declaration of my absolute personal independence. I deliberately turned my back on the sterile living room and marched directly toward the rear exit leading to my detached garage. The freezing winter wind had finally subsided, replaced by the crisp, entirely unforgiving clarity of a cold afternoon. I recognized that my physical survival depended entirely on forward momentum. I needed to fundamentally reconstruct my daily existence from the ground up, utilizing the exact same raw, calloused resilience that had allowed me to originally build this sprawling suburban fortress. I stepped into the dim, deeply familiar space of my old workshop immediately today. I systematically gathered my old trusted tools from the dusty wooden pegboard lining the back wall of the freezing garage. The heavy steel hammers and the beautifully balanced hand saws felt incredibly comforting against my bare, calloused palms. I deliberately channeled the massive, overwhelming reservoir of my paternal grief directly into intense, unyielding physical labor. I began actively soliciting broken wooden furniture from the vulnerable elderly widows residing quietly within my immediate suburban neighborhood. I forcefully dragged heavily damaged oak dining chairs and completely shattered mahogany coffee tables into my personal sanctuary. I spent countless solitary hours meticulously stripping away the decayed layers of ruined varnish and carefully sanding the deeply splintered wood back down to its absolute original, pristine foundation. I firmly glued the entirely fractured structural joints back together, clamping them tightly until they held perfectly strong once again. I forced myself to remain constantly moving, refusing to allow my exhausted mind a single solitary second to wander backward toward the cavernous federal courtroom, or the agonizing memory of Naomi pressing her weeping face against the thick separation glass. The rhythmic, repetitive motion of driving heavy steel nails and applying fresh, smooth lacquer provided a profound, deeply necessary psychological anchor. I silently reconstructed my shattered internal universe by physically repairing the entirely broken physical possessions of my highly appreciative neighbors. These small, consistent acts of deliberate kindness rapidly generated a quiet, undeniable ripple effect entirely across the local residential community. The deeply grateful elderly women eagerly shared my contact information, praising the silent, stoic craftsman who freely restored their precious family heirlooms without ever requesting a single cent of financial compensation. My detached garage completely transformed from a quiet, isolated sanctuary into a highly productive, bustling center of absolute neighborhood restoration. The massive, undeniable volume of my dedicated physical output eventually attracted the direct, immediate attention of a highly prominent local community organization entirely dedicated to residential outreach. A sharp, professionally dressed director named Elena confidently approached my busy driveway one crisp Tuesday morning, carrying a sleek leather clipboard. She explicitly stated that her dedicated social group had actively monitored my extensive charitable carpentry over the past several exhausting months. She watched me effortlessly hoist a fully restored solid oak dresser directly into the back of my weathered pickup truck. She recognized the profound, undeniable value of my raw structural expertise and immediately offered me a purpose today. Elena stood entirely perfectly still within the sprawling driveway and explicitly detailed the ambitious parameters of her sprawling community organization. She passionately explained that they desperately required a highly seasoned master instructor to exclusively spearhead an innovative vocational program specifically designed for local, vulnerable suburban youth. She completely understood my unparalleled structural background and explicitly asked me to formally serve as the primary educational mentor for dozens of deeply troubled teenagers currently navigating incredibly difficult personal circumstances. She offered me the unprecedented opportunity to directly transfer my 4 decades of invaluable industrial knowledge into the highly impressionable minds of a completely new, entirely eager younger generation. I stared directly at her sleek leather clipboard and absorbed the sheer magnitude of the profound responsibility she was actively proposing right now. I slowly nodded my gray head, firmly accepting the vital instructional position without a single fraction of hesitation. The overwhelming, crushing silence that had previously haunted my vast suburban fortress instantly evaporated permanently, replaced by the vibrant, incredibly chaotic energy of dozens of eager, highly motivated teenagers. My detached garage completely evolved into a bustling, incredibly loud educational sanctuary, absolutely overflowing with the rich, highly comforting aroma of freshly cut pine and newly applied lacquer. I spent my long, incredibly productive afternoons explicitly teaching these marginalized young men and women the profound, undeniable value of honest, deeply grueling physical labor. I patiently guided their inexperienced hands, meticulously showing them how to properly measure precisely cut and structurally secure heavy wooden framing. I taught them that true personal strength does not originate from manipulative financial greed, but from the raw, calloused resilience required to physically construct something beautiful entirely from scratch. As the busy, highly rewarding months steadily passed, the agonizing, deeply embedded toxic poison of my ultimate familial betrayal systematically washed completely out of my recovering system. The massive cavernous hole left behind by Naomi's permanent federal incarceration was entirely filled by the immense overflowing gratitude of my dedicated adolescent students. I systematically replaced the terribly broken biological family I had permanently lost with an incredibly vibrant, fiercely loyal local community I actively built with my own 2 bleeding hands. The heavy, unyielding shadows of extreme corporate greed were entirely eradicated from my existence completely today. I finally discovered absolute, undeniable psychological peace entirely within the beautiful, incredibly redemptive rhythm of my daily restorative carpentry right here, entirely forever right now. 2 exact years evaporated since the heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse permanently sealed away my biological past. The sprawling, highly contested industrial lot that Naomi and Colin had desperately attempted to steal no longer resembled a barren, forgotten wasteland. Utilizing the absolute, impenetrable legal framework of the irrevocable trust I had established with Sullivan, the massive parcel of land had been completely transformed. It now proudly hosted a towering state-of-the-art trade school specifically designed for underprivileged youth. The gleaming steel framework and broad sunlit windows stood as a monumental physical testament to honest backbreaking labor. I spent every single sunrise walking the freshly poured concrete corridors, watching the bustling construction crews finalize the sprawling workshops. The heavy machinery and precise architectural lines perfectly replaced the toxic, suffocating greed that had once threatened to entirely consume my existence. My calloused hands ran smoothly along the freshly installed oak workbenches, feeling the solid, undeniable reality of a legacy completely secured against any future familial corruption. The vibrant, chaotic noise of arriving equipment entirely drowned out the lingering ghosts of my former suburban life. However, the absolute tranquility of my reclaimed universe was suddenly challenged on a crisp Tuesday morning. I retrieved a thick, heavily stamped envelope directly from my secure postal box. The harsh, sterile federal tracking numbers clearly indicated its origin from a maximum security women's correctional facility. The neat, highly practiced handwriting belonged entirely to Naomi. The sudden appearance of her meticulously crafted script instantly sent a sharp, agonizing jolt of cold electricity directly down my spine. The thick envelope practically vibrated with desperate, heavily calculated intention. The attached institutional correspondence explicitly claimed she had undergone a profound spiritual awakening behind the freezing concrete walls. The neat, tightly spaced letters boldly declared she had finally found God and entirely changed her deeply malicious ways. She was actively seeking a renewed avenue of communication, desperately attempting to pry open the heavy steel vault I had permanently locked 2 years prior. The physical presence of the letter represented a massive, highly dangerous psychological breach. The carefully chosen words practically begged for my paternal attention, expertly designed to aggressively trigger the deeply buried instincts of a father who had spent 4 decades relentlessly shielding his only child. The dormant, highly toxic tentacles of her manipulation were actively attempting to reach beyond the federal iron bars to infect my newly constructed sanctuary today. I stood perfectly motionless inside the brightly lit administrative office of the newly constructed trade school, holding the heavy federal envelope firmly between my calloused fingers. The slick paper felt incredibly toxic against my bare skin. The intense, overwhelming urge to aggressively tear the meticulously crafted letter into 1,000 unrecognizable shreds burned violently within my chest. I fiercely wanted to obliterate the physical manifestation of her ongoing manipulation. Conversely, a tiny, profoundly dangerous fragment of my former paternal self desperately wanted to tear the seal and blindly absorb her fabricated promises of spiritual redemption. I deeply recognized both immediate reactions as highly destructive emotional traps. Tearing the letter would validate the intense, lingering anger she had maliciously planted inside my soul. Opening the letter would willingly surrender my hard-earned psychological autonomy, instantly allowing her toxic, highly calculated narrative to re-enter my protected mental sanctuary. I slowly inhaled the crisp, clean scent of fresh pine and industrial sealant permeating the new building. I made a deliberate, entirely conscious decision to permanently reject both hazardous pathways. I did not rip the thick envelope apart, nor did I break the federal seal to consume her manufactured apologies. I calmly walked across the polished hardwood floor and opened the bottom drawer of my heavy steel desk. I placed the unopened letter face down against the cold metal bottom. I firmly pushed the heavy drawer shut and engaged the thick brass lock, slipping the small silver key deeply into my canvas pocket. I established a permanent, entirely unbreachable psychological boundary right then and there. I profoundly understood that absolute, genuine forgiveness did not mandate a disastrous resumption of physical or verbal contact. I had successfully forgiven Naomi for aggressively attempting to destroy my existence, completely releasing the suffocating burden of my own burning hatred. However, forgiveness does not automatically erase the severe, entirely irreversible consequences of extreme predatory greed. I absolutely refused to allow her fabricated spiritual awakening to violently jeopardize the pristine, highly productive peace I had meticulously constructed with my own 2 bleeding hands. The heavy steel desk drawer became a permanent vault for a biological relationship that had conclusively died. I deliberately turned my broad shoulders away from the locked desk, entirely severing the final invisible chain linking me to my previous existence. I was totally free, entirely and completely. The grand opening ceremony commenced beneath a brilliantly clear, cloudless afternoon sky. I stepped confidently up to the polished mahogany podium, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of absolute victory grounding my heavy work boots. The massive, gleaming steel letters mounted directly above the primary entrance proudly declared the sprawling educational complex as the Evelyn Foundation. I had explicitly chosen my late wife's name to permanently honor her quiet, unyielding integrity and effectively wash away the toxic stain of our daughter's profound betrayal. The pristine, state-of-the-art building stood as a magnificent, indestructible monument to the fierce, hard-working woman who had initially helped me build our modest life from absolute scratch. I looked out across the expansive, freshly paved courtyard. Hundreds of young, highly determined students sat in perfectly arranged rows, their eyes radiating pure, unadulterated hope. These underprivileged men and women were entirely eager to learn the demanding, deeply rewarding building trades. They possessed the exact same raw, unpolished hunger I had felt 4 decades ago when I first picked up a heavy steel hammer. I gripped the edges of the wooden podium, my calloused hands finding absolute comfort in the sturdy, well-crafted grain. I spoke directly into the sensitive microphone, my voice echoing powerfully across the vast industrial courtyard. I did not speak about the massive corporate conspiracy or the freezing federal prison cells. I explicitly spoke about the profound, undeniable value of honest sweat and the absolute dignity of physical labor. As I watched the bright, incredibly focused faces of the next generation of builders, a profound revelation entirely washed over my recovering soul. I realized with absolute terrifying clarity that true enduring wealth is never hoarded in secret offshore bank accounts or hopelessly tied to incredibly ungrateful, parasitic bloodlines. Absolute wealth is exclusively built through the tangible, enduring legacy you actively leave behind for others to inherit. I had successfully replaced the terribly broken, entirely corrupt biological family I had permanently lost with a massive, fiercely loyal community of dedicated builders. The agonizing, deeply devastating pain of my brutal suburban eviction was entirely replaced by the immense, overflowing pride of this magnificent educational sanctuary. The ruthless, highly calculated predators were securely locked away in their freezing cages, completely erased from my narrative. The silent, meticulous adjustment was finally, totally, and entirely complete right here today, perfectly forever. Your ultimate revenge is simply surviving, thriving, and effectively creating a beautiful legacy that entirely eclipses their absolute darkness. If you found this story inspiring, please subscribe to our channel, share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know where you are listening from today.